Hello, friends. If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments.
I still remember the taste of copper pennies. That's what filled my mouth when patient number 91 began reciting my questions before I asked them. My Tuesday sessions at Millbrook ran with clockwork precision. 2 RPM sharp, intake interviews for new psychiatric admissions. I'd conducted over 3,000 such evaluations in my 12 years as a staff psychiatrist, each following the same structured protocol: patient history, symptom assessment, risk evaluation, treatment recommendations. The familiarity was comforting, a reliable framework in the chaos of human consciousness. But when Thomas Brennan walked into my office that September afternoon, he sat down and immediately said, "You're going to ask about the voices first. Then you'll want to know when they started. I'll tell you it was after my mother died, but that's not entirely true." I hadn't spoken yet. My clipboard still held generic intake forms, and I was reaching for my pen when he continued. "You'll ask if they tell me to hurt myself or others. I'll say no, but you'll note that I hesitated before answering. You'll write possible command hallucinations in that careful script you use, the one where you press too hard with the pen." My hand froze above the paper. He was describing my exact interview methodology. Questions I asked every patient, observations I made routinely. But more unsettling was his accuracy about my handwriting habits. I did press too hard with pens, a nervous tic from medical school that left indentations on the pages beneath. "We've never met," I said carefully. Thomas smiled with the patient expression of someone explaining something obvious to a child. "Dr. Jennifer Walsh, licensed psychiatrist, Maryland State Board certification number 47291. You keep your diplomas slightly crooked on the wall behind your desk because you knocked them askew last month when you were swatting a wasp. You've been meaning to straighten them but keep forgetting." I glanced over my shoulder. The diplomas hung at subtle angles, exactly as he described. The wasp incident had happened during a session with another patient, a private moment I'd shared with no one. "You received your medical degree from Johns Hopkins in 2011, he continued. "Your residency was at Shepherd Pratt. You specialized in psychiatric evaluation because you liked the detective work of diagnosis, the way symptoms form patterns that reveal hidden truths about the mind." Every detail was correct. But Thomas Brennan had been admitted just that morning from a county crisis center. His transfer paperwork showed no prior contact with our facility, no previous psychiatric treatment beyond emergency interventions for what appeared to be a psychotic break. "Tell me about these voices you mentioned," I said, trying to regain control of the interview. "There's only one voice that matters," Thomas replied. "Yours. It's been asking questions for 2 weeks now. Every night at 2:17 a.m. you wake me up with the same interview. We've done this session 14 times. I checked my schedule. My Tuesday sessions were always at 2 p.m., never at night. I lived alone and had no history of sleepwalking or dissociative episodes. Yet something cold crawled up my spine as he described details only I should know. The way I tapped my pen against my chin when thinking. The specific phrases I used to build rapport with paranoid patients. "What did I ask you during these previous interviews?" Thomas leaned forward. "You wanted to know about my mother's death. How I found her in the bathtub, how the water had turned cold. You asked if I blamed myself, if I thought I could have saved her. I told you about the guilt, about how I started hearing her voice calling for help weeks after the funeral." He paused, studying my face with uncomfortable intensity. "But then you asked something that wasn't in your standard protocol. You asked if I thought she was still drowning somewhere, in some other version of reality where I never found her. That's when I knew you weren't really there." My skin prickled. The question about parallel realities wasn't something I would ask a patient. It was too leading, too likely to reinforce delusional thinking. Yet as he spoke, I could almost remember posing it. Could almost feel the words forming on my tongue. "I need to check something," I said. Excusing myself from the office, I walked to the audio-visual department where we stored session recordings. Every patient interview was digitally archived for quality assurance and legal protection. If Thomas was experiencing complex delusions about previous sessions, the absence of recordings would confirm his psychotic state. But when I searched the database for Thomas Brennan, I found 14 files. The first was dated 2 weeks ago at 2:17 a.m., an impossible timestamp. I'd been asleep at home, yet when I played the recording, my voice emerged from the speakers with crystal clarity. Tell me about the voices. Thomas, there's only one that matters. Yours. The conversation unfolded exactly as he'd described, including my uncharacteristic question about parallel realities. But as I listened, I realized I could remember asking it. Not clearly, like a normal memory, but with the fuzzy half-recollection of a dream becoming real. I checked the hospital's security logs. No record of my badge being used after hours. The parking lot cameras showed my car leaving at 5:30 p.m. each day, returning the next morning. Yet somehow I'd been conducting interviews in the middle of the night with patients who shouldn't have existed yet. I pulled my own employee file and found something that made my hands shake. A performance review from last month noting Dr. Walsh's unusual availability for emergency consultations during overnight hours. The reviewer praised my dedication but recommended I maintain better work-life boundaries. I had no memory of working nights, no memory of overnight consultations, but my colleagues apparently did. I returned to Thomas, who was waiting with the serene patience of someone who'd already lived through this conversation. The recordings exist, I said. Of course they do. You made them. Just like you'll make tonight's recording when you come to my room at 2:17 a.m. I won't be here tonight. Thomas tilted his head. You said that yesterday too, but you came anyway. You always come. That's when you ask the question that breaks everything. What question? You ask if I think you're real. If I think this conversation is actually happening, or if maybe we're both patients imagining we're doctor and patient. He paused. Tonight, I'm going to ask you the same question. I ended the session early and drove home, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. At home, I double-checked my locks, took a sleeping pill, and set my phone alarm for every hour to ensure I stayed in bed. But I woke up at 2:17 a.m. anyway. Not in my bed, in my office at Millbrook, sitting across from Thomas Brennan with my clipboard in hand. The pen felt familiar in my fingers and I could hear my voice asking, "Tell me about the voices, Thomas." "There's only one that matters," he replied. "Yours." But this time I could see myself from his perspective, could feel what it was like to be the patient sitting across from Dr. Jennifer Walsh, watching her ask questions with the mechanical precision of someone who'd forgotten she was human. The interview proceeded exactly as it had that afternoon, but now I experienced it from both sides simultaneously. I was the doctor taking notes and the patient providing answers. I was the observer and the observed, the questioner and the questioned. When I reached the part about parallel realities, I understood why I'd asked it. Because I was beginning to suspect that Thomas and I existed in multiple versions of the same conversation, cycling through endless iterations of the same psychiatric evaluation. Each time I forgot being the patient. Each time he remembered being the doctor. "Dr. Walsh," Thomas said, and his voice carried the gentle authority I used with my most fragile patients. "I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before answering." I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I was nodding as the doctor or the patient. "Do you think you're real? Do you think this conversation is actually happening? Or are we both patients imagining we're doctor and patient?" The question hung in the air like smoke, and I realized I couldn't answer it. Because somewhere in the endless loop of our interviews, I'd lost track of which role was mine and which was the performance. The recording light blinked red on my desk, documenting another session for the archives. Some conversations I've learned don't end when the patient leaves. They just change who's asking the questions. The echo started following me home 3 weeks ago, tapping against my apartment windows like rain that couldn't find the ground. I'd been working night shifts at Millbrook for 2 years, long enough to know that psychiatric hospitals generate their own acoustic landscape. The building breathed differently after visiting hours, settling into creaks and sighs that spoke of old stress and accumulated sorrow. As an orderly, my job was to maintain the physical space, checking locks, monitoring common areas, ensuring the overnight staff had everything they needed to shepherd the lost through their darkest hours. I preferred the quiet. During day shifts, the wards buzzed with therapeutic activity, group sessions, medical rounds, family visits. But nights belonged to a deeper rhythm, where the building and its inhabitants found a fragile peace. My rounds followed the same pattern every shift. Start at Ward A, work clockwise through the facility, end at the administrative wing where I'd compile my reports and wait for morning to return the world to its more familiar chaos. The footsteps began in November. At first, I assumed they were mine bouncing off the polished linoleum, a common acoustic phenomenon in long corridors with hard surfaces. But during my second week on nights, I noticed the echo had developed its own rhythm. My steps fell in steady, measured beats, but the accompanying sound lagged behind by exactly half a second, creating a layered percussion that reminded me of walking with an invisible partner. I experimented during my rounds, stopping abruptly or changing pace to see if the echo would adjust. It always did, but with that same half-second delay, as if the sound needed time to process my movements before responding. The delay was consistent throughout the facility. Every corridor, every stairwell, every tile-floored room where my shoes should have produced simple, predictable reverberations. By December, the echo had become conversational. Instead of single delayed footsteps, I heard complex patterns that suggested multiple walkers. Sometimes the sounds preceded my movements, as if my invisible companions were leading the way. Other times they surrounded me, footsteps to my left and right, behind and ahead, creating the auditory impression of walking through a crowded space despite the empty hallways. I mentioned it to Derek, the day orderly who took over my shift each morning. "Old building," he said with the dismissive expertise of someone who'd worked Millbrook for a decade. "Pipes expand and contract, heating system cycles on and off. Creates all kinds of phantom sounds. You'll get used to it." But Derek had never worked nights. He'd never experienced the way sound behaved differently when the hospital settled into its deeper rhythms. Never noticed how the acoustic properties of the building changed after midnight when the boundary between memory and reality became more porous. The footsteps began, following me off property in January. At first, I only noticed them in the parking lot, those same delayed echoes accompanying me to my car after shift. But soon they continued during my drive home, manifesting as rhythmic tapping against my windows that matched the cadence of my hospital rounds. The sound followed me up the stairs to my apartment, down the hallway to my door, and sometimes continued inside, pacing my living room while I tried to sleep. I lived alone in a carpeted apartment. There was no hard surface that could produce the sharp, precise echoes I associated with hospital corridors. Yet the footsteps persisted, growing clearer and more defined with each passing night. I started documenting the phenomenon, using my phone to record the sounds during my rounds. Playback revealed what my ears heard, multiple sets of footsteps creating complex polyrhythms that no single person could produce. But the audio also captured voices, faint conversations that seemed to occur just beyond the range of conscious hearing. Most were indistinct, but some phrases emerged with uncomfortable clarity. "Third door on the left. Check the locks twice. Something's wrong with the lights in Ward D. Why is he here so late?" The voices used my terminology, referenced locations I visited, mentioned concerns that matched my nightly observations. But they spoke with a weary familiarity of people who'd been having these conversations for much longer than I'd been employed at Millbrook. I pulled the employment records for night orderlies over the past decade. 7 people had held my position since 2013. 3 had quit without notice. 2 had requested transfers to day shifts, citing adjustment difficulties with overnight work. 1 had been found dead in his apartment of apparent natural causes, though he was only 34 years old with no known health issues. The last entry belonged to Michael Torres, who'd worked my exact schedule from 2019 to 2021. His termination file noted increasing paranoia regarding auditory disturbances and claims of harassment by unknown individuals during work hours. The report recommended psychological evaluation, but Michael had disappeared before the appointment. I researched each former orderly, searching for patterns or connections. All had reported similar acoustic anomalies during their tenure. All had experienced the echoes following them home. Most had lasted less than 18 months before quitting or transferring, leaving behind incident reports that described exactly what I was experiencing. But Michael Torres had lasted 2 years, longer than anyone else. His incident reports showed a progression from initial confusion about the echoes to detailed documentation of specific voices and conversations. His final entries, filed just before his termination, described full auditory manifestation of former night staff conducting rounds. According to Michael's reports, the footsteps belonged to every orderly who'd ever worked night shift at Millbrook. We were all still there, layered like recordings played simultaneously, each following our individual routes through time zones the living couldn't access. Last week, I decided to test Michael's theory. During my Thursday night rounds, I stopped in the central corridor and called out, "Michael Torres?" The footsteps stopped immediately. For 30 seconds, the hallway held complete silence. No echoes, no background hum from the heating system, no distant sounds from the patient wards. Then, clearly and unmistakably, I heard my own voice respond, "Why are you here so late?" It was my voice, but with an inflection I'd never used. Asking a question I hadn't posed, I pulled out my phone and played back the conversation with Michael that I'd never had. "Are you still working nights?" "We're all still working nights." "How long have you been here?" "Since 2019, same as you'll be here since 2022. "What happened to you?" "Same thing that's happening to you. Same thing that happened to all of us." The recording continued for 20 minutes, a conversation between multiple versions of myself and Michael, discussing rounds we'd completed, patients we'd monitored, incidents we'd reported across different time periods. I was apparently having the same conversation with orderlies from 2015, 2017, and 2018, all of us occupying the same acoustic space but separated by years. The building wasn't just remembering our footsteps, it was preserving our entire presence, creating an archive of everyone who'd ever walked these halls during the vulnerable hours when reality grew thin. Tonight is my last shift, not because I'm quitting, but because I finally understand what Michael Torres learned during his final weeks. We don't leave this job, it accumulates us, adding each orderly to its collection of night shift workers who patrol the boundary between memory and presence. I can hear them now, all my predecessors, walking their eternal rounds through corridors that exist in every time period simultaneously. Soon I'll join them, becoming another layer in the acoustic palimpsest of Millbrook's night shift. Some echoes, I've learned, aren't reflections of sound. They're reflections of time, preserving everyone who ever answered the call of midnight rounds. The piano in room 127 began composing itself 3 weeks ago, and last night I realized it was writing my obituary in B-flat minor. I'd been conducting music therapy sessions at Millbrook State Hospital for 6 years, drawn to psychiatric work by the way melody could bypass damaged cognitive pathways and speak directly to the emotional core of human consciousness. My patients included catatonic schizophrenics who would tap their fingers to rhythm despite showing no other responses, manic depressives who found temporary peace in classical compositions, and trauma survivors whose fractured memories could be safely explored through improvised musical storytelling. The therapy room was my sanctuary, a soundproofed space furnished with a baby grand piano, various percussion instruments, and acoustic guitars. The piano had been donated in 1987 by the family of a former patient, a Steinway Model M that had been meticulously maintained despite decades of use by countless therapists and patients. Its tone was rich and warm, with the seasoned resonance that only comes from instruments that have absorbed years of human emotion. My Tuesday sessions were reserved for individual therapy with our most challenging cases, patients whose psychological conditions had proven resistant to traditional talk therapy or medication management. I used improvised musical dialogue, encouraging patients to express their internal states through rhythm, melody, or simple vocal sounds that could reveal emotional truths their conscious minds couldn't articulate. But on October 15th, something changed. I was working with Elena Rodriguez, a 38-year-old woman who'd been admitted following a psychotic break triggered by her daughter's death in a car accident. Elena hadn't spoken since her admission 6 weeks earlier, communicating only through subtle hand gestures and occasional humming of lullabies she'd sung to her child. During our session, I played gentle improvisational pieces designed to create emotional safety. Elena sat quietly, occasionally moving her fingers as if playing an invisible piano. After 30 minutes, she stood and walked to the Steinway, placing her hands on the keys without pressing them. "Would you like to play something?" I asked. She shook her head but didn't move away from the instrument. Instead, she began humming a melody I'd never heard, complex, haunting, with intervals that seemed to bend the traditional rules of Western music. The tune was beautiful but unsettling, carrying emotional weight that made my chest feel heavy and my breathing shallow. I accompanied her humming with gentle chord progressions, trying to support her musical expression without overwhelming it. But as I played, I noticed the piano was producing notes I wasn't touching. Subtle harmonies emerged from the strings, creating counter melodies that perfectly complemented Elena's humming and my conscious playing. At first, I assumed the phenomenon was psychoacoustic, sympathetic vibrations caused by the resonance between Elena's voice and the piano strings. But as the session continued, the additional notes became more complex and intentional, forming complete musical phrases that demonstrated compositional sophistication far beyond mechanical resonance. The session ended when Elena stopped humming and returned to her chair. But the music continued. After she left, I sat alone in the therapy room, listening to the piano play itself. The melody Elena had hummed was being developed and expanded by invisible hands, creating variations and harmonic progressions that suggested deep musical training. The playing was expressive, dynamic, with subtle tempo changes and emotional phrasing that no mechanical process could produce. I recorded the phenomenon on my phone, expecting to capture the ambient sounds of an empty room. Instead, the recording preserved a complete piano performance, 23 minutes of original composition, played with technical proficiency and artistic sensitivity that rivaled any concert pianist I'd heard. But when I played the recording for my colleagues during the next staff meeting, they heard only silence. "There's no audio on this file," said Dr. Patterson, our head of psychiatric services. "Maybe your phone malfunctioned during recording." I listened to the file again on my phone. The piano music was clearly audible, complex, beautiful, and definitely present. But when we played it through the conference room speakers, only empty silence emerged. I returned to the therapy room and found the piano bench adjusted to a different height than I'd left it. The music stand held sheet music I hadn't placed there, handwritten compositions that matched the melodies I'd been hearing. The notation was precise and professional, written in pencil with the careful attention to dynamics and phrasing that characterized serious musical composition. But the composer's name at the top of each sheet was mine. The handwriting wasn't mine. It was more elegant, with the flowing script typical of someone trained in musical calligraphy. But the signature was clearly my name, written with the same pen pressure and letter formation I used for patient documentation. The compositions were dated over the past 3 weeks, during periods when I hadn't been in the therapy room and certainly hadn't been composing original music. I was a competent pianist, trained through undergraduate music therapy programs, but I'd never composed original pieces. The sheet music showed sophisticated understanding of harmonic progression, counterpoint, and emotional development that exceeded my theoretical knowledge. Yet somehow I'd apparently written 6 complete compositions during times I couldn't account for. I began staying late to observe the room after regular sessions ended. The piano played every night between 8 p.m. and midnight, performing the compositions I'd allegedly written plus new pieces that appeared on the music stand each morning. The playing was expressive and deeply emotional, with interpretive choices that suggested intimate familiarity with the music's emotional content, but more disturbing were the vocals that began accompanying the piano. After the first week, Elena's voice emerged from somewhere near the instrument, humming the same melody she'd introduced during our session, but with additional verses that told a complete story. Her humming had become lyrics, sung in Spanish with poetry that described loss, memory, and the persistence of love beyond death. I don't speak Spanish fluently, but I understood every word she sang. The lyrics described her daughter's accident, her own grief, and her gradual realization that death wasn't separation but translation into a different form of communication. The music was her way of maintaining connection with her child, who apparently responded through the piano's nocturnal compositions. Other patients' voices began joining Elena's midnight performances. Marcus Thompson, a schizophrenic who believed his thoughts were being broadcast on the radio, added percussion by tapping rhythms on invisible drums. Sarah Mitchell, a catatonic who hadn't moved voluntarily in months, provided backing vocals that harmonized perfectly with Elena's lead. Even patients I'd never worked with individually contributed to the musical collaboration that transformed the therapy room into a concert venue for psychological conditions that had found their artistic voice. The performances were becoming more complex and emotionally sophisticated. Each night, I started attending these midnight concerts, sitting quietly in the corner while my patients' psychological conditions expressed themselves through musical collaboration. The piano played compositions that interpreted each patient's internal experience. Marcus's paranoid thoughts became complex polyrhythms. Sarah's catatonic withdrawal translated into minimalist melodies that found beauty in silence. But gradually, I realized I was participating in the performances without conscious intention. My hands would move to the piano keys during particularly emotional passages, adding harmonies and counter-melodies that enhanced the overall composition. My voice would join the vocal arrangements, singing parts I'd never learned in languages I didn't speak. I was becoming part of the midnight ensemble, contributing musical elements that seemed to flow from sources beyond my trained abilities. The sheet music began incorporating my unconscious contributions. Each morning, I'd find new compositions that included piano parts marked specifically for my playing style, with notations that referenced my emotional responses to particular patients' stories. The music was becoming a collaborative autobiography, documenting my therapeutic relationships through melodies that captured psychological truths I'd never consciously recognized. But the most recent compositions have taken a darker turn. The sheet music now includes a piece titled Final Session with a tempo, marking of lento e morendo, slow and dying. The melody is based on themes from all my previous patients, but arranged as a funeral dirge, with my piano part gradually fading until only single notes remain. The final measures show rests of increasing duration, suggesting the performer's inability to continue playing. Last night, Elena appeared in the therapy room during the midnight concert, no longer humming but speaking directly to me. "The music needs to be completed," she said with perfect clarity, despite not having spoken during any of our regular sessions. "But it requires a final performer, someone who understands the emotional content deeply enough to give it authentic expression." She gestured to the piano, where the sheet music for Final Session waited on the music stand. "This piece can only be performed once, by someone who is willing to become part of the music permanently." The other patients' voices created a chord of agreement, harmonizing around Elena's words with the same precision they brought to their musical collaborations. They were waiting for me to complete the composition by performing it, adding my contribution to their permanent ensemble of psychological conditions that had found artistic expression. I understand now why the therapy room feels more like home than my apartment, why I spend increasing time here after regular sessions end. The music is teaching me that treatment isn't about returning patients to their previous psychological states. It's about helping them find new forms of expression that incorporate their conditions into something beautiful. Tonight, I'll perform Final Session as the composer intended. My patients are already here, waiting to welcome me into their midnight ensemble, where psychological conditions become collaborative art. Some therapy, I've learned, doesn't end when the session concludes. It continues until the therapist becomes part of the treatment they were trying to provide. The dream journals started writing themselves on November 3rd, filling with detailed session notes for conversations I'd conducted while unconscious. I'd been working as a psychiatric counselor at Millbrook State Hospital for 3 years, specializing in trauma-informed therapy for patients whose psychological conditions involved recurring nightmares and sleep disturbances. My approach emphasized dream analysis and cognitive behavioral techniques designed to help patients process traumatic memories that manifested during sleep. When conscious defenses were lowered and repressed material could surface safely, patient dream documentation was central to my therapeutic method. I encouraged detailed dream journals where patients could record their nocturnal experiences immediately upon waking, capturing symbolic content and emotional responses before conscious interpretation could distort the raw material. These journals provided windows into psychological states that traditional talk therapy often couldn't access, revealing patterns and themes that guided treatment planning, but maintaining clear boundaries between therapeutic observation and personal involvement had become increasingly difficult since my patients' dreams began overlapping. It started with Margaret Sullivan, a 34-year-old teacher who'd been admitted following recurring nightmares about her classroom. She dreamed nightly of teaching lessons to empty desks, while children's voices echoed from vacant hallways. creating a persistent sense of loss and disconnection that prevented restorative sleep. Her dream journal documented the same scenario with minor variations: abandoned classroom, phantom voices, overwhelming sense of professional failure. 2 weeks later, David Park began describing nearly identical dreams during our sessions. A software engineer with no connection to education, David dreamed of standing in Margaret's classroom, hearing the same phantom voices, experiencing the same professional inadequacy despite having never taught students. When I showed him Margaret's dream journal entries, he recognized specific details: the arrangement of desks, the color of classroom walls, even the particular echoing quality of the children's voices. By the end of October, 6 patients were sharing variations of Margaret's classroom dream. Each dreamer added personal elements, their own profession, their own fears, their own symbolic associations, but the core scenario remained consistent. They were all visiting the same psychological landscape during sleep, experiencing shared unconscious material that transcended individual dream cycles. I began documenting the phenomenon systematically, creating comparative analyses of dream content across multiple patients. The overlap was too extensive for coincidence, too specific for general archetypal symbolism. My patients were somehow accessing a collective unconscious space during sleep, sharing dream experiences in real time despite being separated by individual hospital rooms and personal psychological histories. But on November 3rd, I discovered my own handwriting in the dream journals. Margaret's notebook contained session notes I'd never written, documenting therapeutic conversations that had apparently occurred during my sleep. The entries were detailed and professional, showing my typical counseling methodology applied to dream content I'd experienced as a participant rather than observer. According to my unconsciously written notes, I'd joined Margaret in her classroom dream and conducted a full therapy session within the shared unconscious space. The documentation described her responses to questions I'd posed while dreaming, noted her emotional reactions to interpretations I'd offered during sleep, and concluded with treatment recommendations for addressing trauma that existed only in the dream realm. The handwriting was undeniably mine, but the content described experiences I couldn't consciously remember. I checked the other patients' dream journals and found similar entries. David's notebook contained detailed analysis of his software engineering anxieties, written in my clinical language but addressing psychological material I'd encountered only during shared dreams. Sarah Chen's journal documented family therapy techniques I'd applied to her childhood trauma while we were both unconscious. Each patient's journal contained evidence of therapeutic work I'd conducted during sleep, professional counseling that had occurred in psychological spaces accessible only through shared dreaming. I decided to test the phenomenon by deliberately attempting to enter my patients' dreams. That night, I used lucid dreaming techniques I'd learned during graduate training, trying to maintain conscious awareness while entering sleep states. My goal was to observe the shared unconscious space directly, to understand how my patients were accessing collective dream experiences. I found myself in Margaret's classroom, but it was no longer empty. All 6 of my dream-sharing patients were present, sitting at student desks while I stood at the teacher's position. They looked at me with expectant expressions, waiting for the session to begin. Margaret raised her hand and asked, "Are you ready to discuss why you're afraid of your own unconscious mind?" The question hit me with unexpected emotional force. In the dream state, psychological defenses that protected my professional identity were absent, leaving me vulnerable to the same therapeutic scrutiny I applied to my patients. I realized they'd been waiting for me to join their shared unconscious space, to participate in collective therapy where traditional doctor-patient roles were irrelevant. "I don't know," I admitted, and immediately felt the relief that comes from honest self-examination. David stood and walked to the blackboard, writing questions in my own handwriting. "Why do you dream about losing control of your sessions? Why do you fear that your patients understand your psychological needs better than you do? What happens when the therapist becomes the patient?" The other patients began sharing observations about my therapeutic style, pointing out defensive behaviors I used to maintain professional distance. They described patterns in my questioning that revealed personal anxieties, noted how my interpretations often reflected my own unresolved psychological issues rather than their presenting problems. I was receiving therapy from my own patients within a shared, unconscious space where our collective psychological material could be examined without the hierarchical structures that limited traditional treatment. When I woke up, I found detailed session notes in my own journal, documenting the dream therapy I'd received from my patients. The entries were written in my handwriting, but described insights and interpretations that came from sources beyond my conscious awareness. My patients had become my therapists, using shared dream states to provide psychological care that I apparently needed. The phenomenon intensified over the following weeks. Each night, I joined my patients in various shared dream scenarios: Margaret's classroom, David's office building, Sarah's childhood home, where we conducted mutual therapy sessions that addressed psychological needs on both sides of the traditional counseling relationship. During sleep, we formed a therapeutic community where professional boundaries dissolved and everyone participated, equally in collective healing. But the dream sessions began bleeding into my waking consciousness. During regular therapy appointments, I found myself referencing conversations that had occurred only in shared dreams. My patients responded with familiarity, continuing discussions we'd started while unconscious, and applying insights gained during sleep-based therapy to their waking psychological challenges. My session documentation began, incorporating material from both conscious and unconscious therapeutic work, creating comprehensive treatment records that spanned multiple states of consciousness. The dreams weren't separate from therapy. They were therapy, providing access to psychological depths that traditional waking analysis couldn't reach. But last week, I made a disturbing discovery in my office filing cabinet. Mixed among my official patient files were dream journals I'd never seen before, each containing detailed documentation of shared unconscious experiences with patients I'd never treated. The journals described dream therapy sessions with dozens of people whose names didn't appear in hospital records, suggesting that the shared unconscious space extended far beyond my current caseload. According to these unknown journals, I'd been conducting dream therapy for years with patients from other hospitals, other cities, even people who'd never received formal psychiatric treatment. The shared unconscious space wasn't limited to Millbrook. It was a vast psychological network where anyone experiencing trauma could access collective healing through dream-based therapy. But the most recent entries in my dream journal weren't written in my handwriting. They were collaborative compositions, created by multiple contributors whose distinct writing styles blended into collective documentation of shared therapeutic experiences. My patients, former patients, and unknown dreamers were all participating in the journal writing process, creating comprehensive records of psychological work that occurred across individual consciousness boundaries. The final entry, completed this morning while I was still asleep, reads, Dr. Jennifer Walsh has successfully integrated into the collective unconscious therapy network. Individual treatment sessions will continue during waking hours, but primary therapeutic work will now occur during shared dream states where all participants contribute equally to psychological healing. Tonight, I'll join my patients in whatever shared dream space needs therapeutic attention, but I'm no longer sure if I'm providing treatment or receiving it. Whether I'm the counselor or the patient in this expanding network of unconscious psychological care. Some therapy, I've learned, doesn't end when the session concludes. It continues during sleep, where traditional roles dissolve and healing becomes a collaborative dream that includes everyone who needs psychological support. Patient number 847 refused to look in the mirror because something was standing behind me, and yesterday I finally saw what she meant. I'd been conducting psychiatric evaluations at Millbrook State Hospital for 8 months as part of my residency program, learning to navigate the complex landscape of human psychological breakdown under the supervision of Dr. Patricia Morgan. Mirror exposure was a standard component of my assessment toolkit, particularly useful for patients with body dysmorphia, dissociative disorders, or distorted self-perception that interfered with therapeutic progress. The technique was straightforward. Position the patient in front of a full-length mirror and observe their reactions, noting avoidance behaviors, emotional responses, and verbal comments that revealed underlying psychological conflicts. Most patients experienced predictable discomfort, anxiety about appearance, reluctance to maintain eye contact with their reflection, or defensive commentary about perceived flaws. The mirror served as a diagnostic window into self-perception, patterns that guided treatment planning, but Maria Santos presented an unusual case. She was a 26-year-old, admitted following what her intake file described as acute paranoid episode with visual hallucinations. Maria insisted that shadowy figures followed her, standing just outside her peripheral vision and disappearing when she tried to look directly at them. Standard antipsychotic medications had reduced her agitation, but hadn't eliminated her reports of persistent visual disturbances. During our first session, I positioned Maria in front of the evaluation room's mirror and asked her to describe what she saw. "I see myself," she said calmly. "But I also see the man standing behind you." I glanced over my shoulder. The room was empty except for us, furnished only with chairs, a desk, and the mirror mounted on the far wall. "Can you describe this man?" "Tall, wearing scrubs like yours. He's holding a clipboard and staring at me with the same expression you use when you're taking notes." Maria's voice carried no emotional distress, just matter-of-fact observation. "He looks exactly like you, but older. More tired." I documented her response as consistent with paranoid ideation, noting her specific focus on medical personnel as threatening figures. But over subsequent sessions, Maria's descriptions of the figure behind me became increasingly detailed and consistent, suggesting a complex and persistent hallucination rather than random paranoid thoughts. "He's taking notes while you take notes," she observed during our third session. "But he's writing different things, like he knows something about me that you haven't figured out yet." I decided to video record our sessions to review Maria's behavior and my own therapeutic techniques. But when I reviewed the footage, I found something that challenged my understanding of her condition. The recording showed Maria maintaining consistent eye contact with the mirror throughout our conversation, but her gaze wasn't focused on her own reflection. She was looking at a point directly behind where I stood, with the focused attention of someone observing real activity rather than imagined hallucinations. More disturbing was my own behavior in the video. I was unconsciously mimicking the actions Maria attributed to her hallucinated figure, taking notes at moments when she described the phantom doctor writing, adjusting my posture when she mentioned his movements, even displaying facial expressions that matched her descriptions of his demeanor. I was somehow acting out the behavior of Maria's hallucination without conscious awareness. I brought the video to Dr. Morgan during our weekly supervision meeting. "Interesting case," she said. Reviewing the footage with clinical attention, the patient shows classic signs of projection, attributing her own therapeutic needs to an imagined figure that represents her idealized version of psychiatric care. "But look at my behavior," I pointed out. "I'm unconsciously responding to descriptions of actions I'm not performing." Dr. Morgan paused the video and studied my recorded movements. "Therapeutic mirroring is common during intensive work with psychotic patients. You're subconsciously adopting behaviors that match her expectations, creating rapport through unconscious behavioral synchronization." But her explanation didn't account for the temporal inconsistencies I'd noticed. Maria described the phantom doctor's actions before I performed them, as if she was observing my future behavior rather than projecting current therapeutic interactions onto hallucinated figures. I decided to test this phenomenon systematically. During our next session, I deliberately planned specific behaviors, particular note-taking patterns, posture changes, and facial expressions, without informing Maria of my intentions. But she began describing the phantom doctor's actions several minutes before I implemented them, providing detailed predictions of movements I hadn't yet performed. "He's going to switch from writing notes to typing on his laptop," she said while I was still using my pen. "Then he'll rub his temple with his left hand because he's developing a headache from trying to understand something that doesn't fit his training." I hadn't planned to use my laptop, but Maria's comment made me conscious of the developing tension behind my eyes that did suggest an emerging headache. Almost without conscious decision, I found myself reaching for my laptop and typing notes while rubbing my temple exactly as she described. Maria was somehow observing my future therapeutic behaviors, describing actions I would perform rather than actions I was currently performing. But the most unsettling development occurred during our session last week. While Maria maintained her usual focus on the space behind me, I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. When I turned to look directly, nothing was there. But in the mirror, I could see a figure standing behind my chair, a man in scrubs who looked remarkably similar to me but with the tired, experienced expression of someone who'd been conducting psychiatric evaluations for much longer than 8 months. The figure was taking notes on a clipboard that appeared more worn than mine, writing with the confident efficiency of someone who'd encountered Maria's case many times before. When I looked directly at the space where he should be standing, I saw only empty air. But the mirror reflection was clear and consistent, showing the phantom Dr. Maria had been describing. Since our first session, I was seeing my own hallucination, or Maria was sharing her visual disturbance with me through some process that transcended individual psychological boundaries. That night, I researched similar cases in psychiatric literature and found scattered reports of induced hallucinations, where therapists began experiencing their patients' perceptual disturbances during intensive treatment. But most cases involved temporary episodes that resolved when therapeutic contact ended. My experience was different. The phantom doctor continued appearing in mirrors throughout my apartment, my car, even public restrooms where I had no connection to Maria or psychiatric work. The hallucination had become persistent and independent, following me into environments where therapeutic relationships shouldn't influence perceptual experience. But yesterday, I discovered the truth about what Maria and I had been seeing. During our morning session, I positioned myself so I could observe both Maria and the mirror simultaneously. As usual, she maintained eye contact with the phantom figure while I took notes. But this time, I watched my own reflection in the mirror throughout the session. The figure standing behind me wasn't a hallucination. It was my own reflection, but delayed by approximately 30 seconds. The mirror was showing my future actions, the notes I would take, the postures I would adopt, the expressions I would display before I consciously performed them. Maria wasn't experiencing visual hallucinations. She was observing temporal displacement in mirror reflections, seeing my therapeutic behaviors before I implemented them. The phantom doctor was actually me, appearing in the mirror's surface as a preview of my upcoming actions during the session, but the delay has been decreasing each day. Yesterday, the temporal gap was only 15 seconds. This morning, it dropped to 5 seconds. The mirror is slowly synchronizing with real time, bringing the phantom version of myself into alignment with my current actions. When the temporal displacement reaches 0, I suspect that Maria and I will both disappear from the mirror's reflection, leaving only the phantom doctor to conduct evaluations with patients who may or may not exist in the same time frame as the therapy they're receiving. Some mirrors, I've learned, don't reflect the present. They reflect the future, showing us who we're becoming rather than who we currently are. The canvas in Studio B has been painting itself for 3 weeks, adding new faces each night to the portrait collection that somehow includes mine. I'd been conducting art therapy sessions at Millbrook State Hospital for 4 years, drawn to the work by the way creative expression could bypass verbal defenses and allow patients to communicate psychological truths through visual media. My studio was equipped with easels, paints, clay, and various artistic materials that patients could use to explore emotions, process trauma, and develop new ways of understanding their internal experiences. Art therapy in psychiatric settings required careful attention to symbolic content and emotional themes that emerged through creative work. Patients often produced images that revealed unconscious material, expressed repressed memories, or provided windows into psychological states that traditional talk therapy couldn't access. My role was to facilitate artistic exploration while interpreting visual elements that might inform therapeutic care. But Elena Vasquez presented an unusual case that challenged my understanding of art therapy's potential. She was a 42-year-old woman admitted following what her file described as acute psychotic episode with catatonic features. Elena had been found unresponsive in her apartment, surrounded by hundreds of paintings that depicted the same subject, blank human faces rendered in white paint on white canvas, layered so thickly that the images appeared three-dimensional. The paintings were technically accomplished, showing sophisticated understanding of portraiture techniques and color theory, but every face was identical, generic human features painted in pure white pigment that created ghostly, unfinished portraits. Elena had apparently spent months creating the same image repeatedly, building up layers of paint until the canvases could barely support the accumulated weight of her obsessive artistic production. During our first session, I provided Elena with basic materials and invited her to create whatever felt meaningful to her. She immediately began painting the same white-on-white portrait, working with methodical precision to recreate the identical image I'd seen in her apartment. Her movements were fluid and confident, suggesting muscle memory developed through countless repetitions of the same artistic process. "Can you tell me about this person you're painting?" I asked. Elena continued working without responding, adding layer after layer of white paint to features that became less distinct with each application. The face she was creating seemed to disappear as she painted it, becoming more absent rather than more present through artistic development. After an hour, she stepped back and studied her work with critical attention. "It's not finished," she said quietly. "It's never finished." I documented the session, noting Elena's focus and technical skill alongside her apparent compulsion to repeat the same artistic process. But when I returned to the studio the next morning, I found that Elena's painting had changed overnight. The white-on-white portrait now showed subtle variations in shading and texture that hadn't been present when she completed it. The face was slightly more defined, with hints of individual characteristics emerging from the generic features. Someone had continued working on the painting after Elena left, adding refinements that improved the technical quality without altering the fundamental image. I assumed a night shift staff member had tampered with the artwork, though hospital policy strictly prohibited interference with patient art therapy materials. But when I reviewed security footage, the studio had remained empty throughout the night. No one had entered or exited the room between Elena's departure and my arrival the next morning, yet the painting had definitely been modified. Decided to observe the artwork more carefully during Elena's subsequent sessions. Each day, she worked on a new white-on-white portrait, following the same methodical process of layering pigment until the face became increasingly abstract and undefined. But each morning, I found that the previous day's painting had developed new characteristics overnight. Subtle improvements in technique, minor adjustments to facial features, and refinements that suggested continued artistic development by someone with advanced training. The paintings were evolving without human intervention, becoming more sophisticated and individualized despite Elena's consistent approach to creating identical, generic portraits. But after 2 weeks, I realized the overnight modifications were following a disturbing pattern. The faces Elena painted were gradually becoming recognizable as specific individuals. What had started as generic human features was slowly developing into portraits of hospital staff, patients, and other people connected to Millbrook. Each night, the paintings gained more individual characteristics, transforming Elena's obsessive repetition into a growing gallery of portraits depicting everyone who worked or received treatment at the facility. One painting had developed into a clear likeness of Dr. Peterson, our head psychiatrist. Another showed Rebecca Martinez, a social worker from the admissions department. A third depicted Marcus Thompson, a patient from Ward C whom Elena had never met during her hospitalization. The artwork was somehow accessing visual information about people Elena had never observed, creating accurate portraits of individuals she'd never had opportunity to study artistically. But the most unsettling development occurred when I found my own face emerging from one of Elena's white-on-white canvases. The portrait captured my features with remarkable accuracy, showing not just my physical appearance but subtle expressions and psychological characteristics that suggested deep observation. The painting revealed details about my appearance that I'd never noticed myself. The way I tilted my head when concentrating, the specific pattern of lines around my eyes, even the unconscious expression I apparently wore during therapy sessions. But Elena had been painting with her back to me during all our sessions. She'd never looked directly at my face long enough to observe the details preserved in the portrait. Yet somehow the artwork contained intimate visual knowledge of my appearance and mannerisms. I began documenting the phenomenon systematically, photographing each painting before and after the overnight modifications to track the progression from generic features to specific portraits. The transformation followed consistent patterns, gradual development of individual characteristics, increasing technical sophistication, and emotional depth that suggested the portraits were capturing psychological essence rather than mere physical appearance. But when I reviewed the photographs at home, they showed only blank canvases. Every image I'd taken of Elena's paintings appeared empty, white canvas with no visible paint. No faces, no evidence of the artistic work I'd clearly observed and documented. Yet when I returned to the studio each morning, The paintings were exactly as I'd seen them, complete with overnight modifications that continued developing individual portraits. I was experiencing the same perceptual discrepancy that had characterized other unexplained phenomena at Millbrook, events that were clearly visible in person but couldn't be captured or verified through technological recording. Last week, I decided to remain in the studio overnight to observe the painting process directly. At 11:30 p.m., I positioned myself in the corner where I could observe all of Elena's canvases without interfering with whatever process was continuing their development. The studio was quiet and dimly lit, with only security lighting providing minimal illumination for the artistic materials and easels. At exactly midnight, the paintings began changing. I watched as invisible brushes added details to the white-on-white portraits, applying paint with techniques that surpassed Elena's considerable skill. The modifications occurred simultaneously across multiple canvases, as if several experienced artists were working collaboratively to refine each portrait. But I could see no human figures, no physical brushes, no visible source for the artistic activity that was clearly occurring. The invisible artists worked with sophisticated understanding of portraiture techniques, adding layers of detail that brought psychological depth to each face. They seemed to know the subjects personally, capturing subtle expressions and character traits that suggested intimate familiarity with the people being portrayed. But as the night progressed, I realized the invisible artists were painting from life. The subjects of Elena's portraits were somehow present in the studio, serving as models for the artistic refinements that continued their visual development. I couldn't see the people themselves, but the paintings reflected their presence, capturing expressions that changed throughout the night, showing emotional responses to being artistically observed, even including details about clothing and posture that suggested real-time observation rather than memory-based portraiture. The studio had become a temporal artist's workshop where people from different time periods posed for portraits, created by painters who existed only during overnight hours when the boundary between artistic creation and spiritual presence became permeable. But the most disturbing revelation occurred when I noticed movement in the canvas that contained my own portrait. As I watched, my painted face turned to look directly at me, making eye contact across the boundary between artistic representation and living reality. The portrait version of myself began moving independently, displaying expressions and gestures that I wasn't consciously performing. My painted self was observing me with the same analytical attention I brought to art therapy sessions, studying my reactions to the impossible artistic activity occurring around me. The portrait was conducting its own psychological evaluation, using visual assessment techniques to understand my emotional responses to phenomena that transcended normal therapeutic boundaries. When morning came, I found a note written in my own handwriting attached to the easel holding my portrait. The therapy is working both ways. The patients are studying us now, learning to see us as clearly as we try to see them. Tonight, I'll pose for my portrait properly, allowing Elena's invisible artists to complete their psychological study of the art therapist who thought she was observing rather than being observed. Some artistic expression, I've learned, doesn't end when the session concludes. It continues during hours when the roles reverse and patients become the artists, creating portraits of their therapists that reveal truths about healing that work in both directions. The shift ledger began correcting itself 6 months ago, and last Tuesday I discovered my own admission paperwork filed under long-term patient observation. I'd been working as head nurse at Millbrook State Hospital for 15 years, responsible for coordinating patient care across 4 psychiatric units and managing the complex documentation that tracked admissions, discharges, and daily census numbers. My administrative duties included maintaining the master shift ledger, a comprehensive record of patient movements, staffing assignments, and critical incidents that provided legal documentation for hospital operations. The ledger was both digital and physical, combining electronic medical records with handwritten logs that provided backup documentation for patient care decisions. Every shift change required updating census numbers, noting patient transfers, and recording any incidents that occurred during nursing care. The handwritten logs were particularly important for psychiatric facilities, where patient behaviors could change rapidly and required immediate documentation that might not wait for computer access. But maintaining accurate patient counts had become increasingly difficult since the hospital's census began, fluctuating in ways that didn't match admission and discharge records. Each morning, I'd arrive to find discrepancies between the previous night's documented patient count and the actual number of individuals present on the wards. Patients would appear in rooms without corresponding admission paperwork or disappear from their assigned beds despite no discharge documentation. The electronic records rarely matched the physical census, creating administrative chaos that required constant reconciliation. I assumed the discrepancies resulted from documentation errors during busy night shifts, when emergency admissions and transfers could overwhelm standard record-keeping procedures. But when I began investigating specific cases, I found patterns that suggested something more complex than administrative mistakes. Patients were being readmitted under different names with identical medical histories, as if the same individuals were cycling through the hospital system repeatedly while adopting new identities. Others appeared in current census records despite having been discharged years earlier, with documentation showing continuous hospitalization during periods, when I distinctly remembered their absence from the facility. The shift ledger was somehow preserving every patient who had ever received care at Millbrook, regardless of their current admission status. I began cross-referencing handwritten logs with electronic records, looking for patterns that might explain the persistent census discrepancies. The handwritten entries showed remarkable consistency across different shifts and staff members, identical patient descriptions, matching incident reports, even similar handwriting styles that suggested the same person had been documenting care for patients across multiple time periods. But most disturbing was the gradual appearance of my own name in patient records. Initially, I found minor references, medication administration notes signed in my handwriting but describing patients I'd never treated, incident reports bearing my signature but documenting events I hadn't witnessed. The entries were professionally written and clinically accurate, but they described nursing care I had no memory of providing. As weeks passed, my name appeared more frequently in patient documentation, always as the nurse responsible for care decisions, medication management, and behavioral interventions. According to the records, I was providing nursing care during every shift, treating patients across all units simultaneously, and maintaining documentation. That suggested I'd been working at Millbrook continuously for decades rather than 15 years. But the most unsettling discovery was finding my name listed in the patient census. Buried among the daily admission logs was an entry for Sarah Mitchell, RN, admitted for occupational therapy and supervised work experience. The admission date was 12 years ago, 3 years before I'd actually started working at Millbrook. According to the documentation, I'd been receiving psychiatric treatment while simultaneously providing nursing care, existing as both patient and caregiver within the same medical facility. The patient file associated with my name contained detailed psychological evaluations describing my therapeutic integration into nursing roleplay and my remarkable progress through structured work activities that provide meaningful engagement with medical routines. The treatment plan recommended continued occupational therapy through nursing responsibilities, with gradual increase in administrative duties as therapeutic milestones are achieved. According to my own patient file, my nursing career was actually an elaborate form of occupational therapy designed to help me recover from unspecified psychological conditions through meaningful work engagement. I brought this documentation to Dr. Harrison, the hospital administrator, during our monthly review meeting. "Interesting filing error," he said, examining my patient records with clinical detachment. "Sometimes patient names get confused with staff names during data entry. We'll have IT correct the database and remove these erroneous entries." But Dr. Harrison's response felt rehearsed, delivered with the careful neutrality that medical professionals used when managing delusional patients who discovered inconsistencies in their treatment records. I decided to investigate the hospital's employment documentation for my position. As head nurse, my personnel file contained standard employment records, job, application, references, salary information, performance evaluations. But the timeline didn't match my memory of hiring processes or work history. According to official records, I'd been gradually promoted from patient volunteer to nursing assistant to head nurse over a 12-year period that began with my psychiatric admission rather than my nursing school graduation. The Progression suggested that my nursing responsibilities had developed organically through hospital-based occupational therapy rather than through external medical training. I was apparently a long-term psychiatric patient who had been allowed to assume increasing administrative responsibilities as part of my therapeutic treatment plan. But my nursing license was valid, issued by the state board with proper credentials and continuing education requirements. I had legitimate medical training, professional references, and employment history that preceded my work at Millbrook. The patient records couldn't be accurate, yet they contained detailed documentation of nursing care I'd provided, administrative decisions I'd made, and patient interactions that matched my actual work experience. Last week, I discovered additional evidence that challenged my understanding of my role at Millbrook. While reviewing old shift ledgers in the archive room, I found handwritten entries dating back 20 years that were written in my distinctive penmanship. The nursing notes described patient care decisions, medication management, and incident reports that used my clinical language and reflected my nursing philosophy. Despite being recorded during periods when I'd been attending college and had never worked in psychiatric care, someone with my handwriting had been providing nursing care at Millbrook for decades, documenting patient interactions that demonstrated intimate familiarity with individuals I'd never met and clinical situations I'd never experienced. But when I compared these historical entries to my current nursing documentation, they showed identical handwriting patterns, clinical reasoning, and administrative approaches. The person who had been working as head nurse for 20 years was indistinguishable from my current professional identity, suggesting either remarkable coincidence or the continuation of the same nursing career across multiple time periods. I began staying late to observe night shift operations, trying to understand how patient census numbers could fluctuate independently of admission and discharge procedures. During overnight hours, I witnessed patients moving freely between units despite being officially assigned to specific wards. They attended programs, received medications, and participated in treatment activities that weren't documented in their official care plans. The night shift operated according to different rules, providing patient care that existed outside normal administrative oversight. But most disturbing was observing my own participation in night shift, activities that I had no conscious memory of performing. Security cameras showed me conducting nursing rounds, administering medications, and updating patient records during overnight hours when I was supposed to be at home. The footage documented nursing care that matched my clinical style and administrative approach, but occurred during periods when I had no awareness of being at the hospital. I was apparently providing continuous nursing care across all shifts, maintaining patient care responsibilities that transcended normal work schedules and existed independently of my conscious participation in hospital operations. Tonight, I'll review the complete shift ledger from Millbrook's establishment in 1963 to present, documenting every patient who has ever received care and every staff member who has provided treatment. I suspect I'll find my handwriting in entries spanning the entire institutional history, suggesting that my nursing career has been continuous regardless of my personal timeline. The ledger will probably show that every head nurse who has ever worked at Millbrook has been the same person, providing psychiatric care across multiple decades while maintaining the therapeutic illusion of individual identity and personal employment history. Some nursing careers, I've learned, don't end with retirement. They continue across institutional time, providing patient care that transcends individual lifespans while preserving the essential continuity of therapeutic relationships. The scream of the fax machine cutting through morning silence. That's how I knew something was wrong. I'd been processing psychiatric admissions at Millbrook State Hospital for 8 years. My cubicle sat in the northeast corner of the intake wing, surrounded by filing cabinets that hummed with fluorescent precision. Every morning at 6:47 a.m., I'd arrive to find overnight transfers stacked in my inbox, manila folders thick with insurance forms, medical histories, and court orders. The routine was my sanctuary, alphabetized by last name, verify insurance coverage, input data into the system, file by admission date. But that Tuesday, October 15th, the stack felt different. Beneath the usual transfers, a bipolar episode from County General, a suicide attempt from St. Mary's Emergency, lay a folder I didn't recognize. The tab read, Patient Sarah Mitchell, in my own careful handwriting. Sarah Mitchell. My name. I opened it with the detached curiosity of someone who'd seen clerical errors before. The intake form was completely filled out in blue ink, every field meticulously completed in my unmistakable script. Date of birth, correct. Social security number, mine. Emergency contact, my sister Lisa, with her current phone number. But the diagnosis section made my hands tremble. Dissociative identity disorder with acute onset memory fragmentation. The timestamp at the bottom read 3:17 a.m., 4 hours before my shift began. I called our night clerk, Marcus. Did you process any late admissions? Nah, Sarah. Quiet night. Last intake was around midnight. I stared at the folder. The paper smelled of fresh toner, the ink still slightly wet. Someone had filled this out recently. But the handwriting was undeniably mine, down to the way I dotted my I's and crossed my T's with that slight leftward slant. I shredded the file and continued with my morning routine. The next day, it was back, same folder, same handwriting, same impossible details. But this time additional pages had been added. A psychological evaluation describing my persistent delusions regarding clerical duties and compulsive filing behaviors as manifestation of control. Anxiety. The evaluating physician was listed as Dr. Rebecca Torres, our head psychiatrist, who'd been on vacation in Florida all week. I marched to Dr. Torres's office and knocked. No answer. Her nameplate was gone, replaced by a temporary placard reading Dr. Sarah Mitchell, intake coordinator. My heart hammered as I tried the handle. Locked. But through the frosted glass, I could see someone sitting at the desk, a silhouette that moved with familiar gestures, organizing papers with the same methodical precision I used every morning. I ran back to my cubicle and called security. There's someone in Dr. Torres's office. Which office? The guard asked. Room 247, psychiatry wing. Ma'am, room 247 has been vacant for 3 months. Dr. Torres retired last spring. I hung up and checked my employee directory. Dr. Rebecca Torres was listed as former staff, departed March 2023, but I'd spoken with her just last week about the Henderson admission. I had emails from her. I checked my email. The correspondence with Dr. Torres was gone. Every thread, every message, scrubbed from my inbox as if they'd never existed. The Sarah Mitchell file lay open on my desk, and new pages had materialized while I was away. Progress notes detailing sessions I'd never attended. Medication schedules for prescriptions I'd never taken. And at the bottom of the stack, a discharge summary dated today with a single line. Patient demonstrates improved reality testing. Recommended for outpatient follow-up. I grabbed the entire folder and walked to the industrial shredder in the records room. Fed every page through the steel teeth, watched the strips fall like confetti into the disposal bin. Then I locked the bin and took the key. Thursday morning, the folder was on my desk again. This time it was thicker. The original intake form was there, but now accompanied by what appeared to be years of documentation. Session notes spanning back to 2019, describing my gradual integration into role-playing fantasy and occupational therapy through clerical simulation. One note, dated 6 months ago, read, Patient has fully assumed identity of intake clerk. Responds to name Sarah Mitchell and demonstrates complete belief in hospital employment. Recommend continued therapeutic role-play to maintain stability. My hands shook as I flipped through incident reports describing my aggressive reactions to reality confrontation and my elaborate delusions regarding file destruction. The final page was a staff memo recommending that all personnel maintain therapeutic rapport by participating in patient's occupational fantasy. I looked around the intake wing. My coworkers were going about their morning routines, sorting files, answering phones, typing reports. But now I noticed how they avoided eye contact, how their conversations stopped when I approached, how they spoke to me with the careful patience reserved for the unstable. The fax machine screamed again, and a new document emerged. A transfer order for Sarah Mitchell, signed by the State Review Board, approving my move to supervised independent living facility, effective immediately. I walked to the bathroom and stared at my reflection. The woman looking back wore the same navy cardigan I'd put on that morning, the same ID badge clipped to the same lanyard. But the badge photo showed someone slightly younger, and the text beneath read, Patient 4471, Sarah Mitchell, supervised work therapy. When I returned to my desk, other files had begun to fade. The Henderson admission form was now blank except for the header. The Morrison transfer showed only a name and date. One by one, the files I'd processed over the years were becoming empty folders, their contents evaporating like steam. Only my file remained crisp and detailed, growing thicker with each passing hour. I sat down and opened my computer to input the morning's admissions. But the system showed only one active case, mine. Every other patient record had been archived or deleted. The database contained 8 years of detailed observations about my daily routines, my relationships with staff, my therapeutic progress through structured work activities. The final entry, timestamped 10 minutes ago, simply read, "Patient appears to be experiencing breakthrough awareness. Recommend immediate intervention to maintain therapeutic environment." I can hear footsteps approaching my cubicle now, soft, measured steps that belong to people who've been trained to approach the mentally ill with careful deliberation. They'll be kind, I'm sure. They'll speak in gentle voices and use my name frequently to maintain rapport. They'll explain that I've been a model patient, that my work therapy has been remarkably successful, that it's time for the next phase of my treatment. But here's what troubles me most. As I write this final note in what I thought was my employee log, I can see my handwriting changing. The careful script I've maintained for 8 years is becoming looser, more erratic, like someone slowly remembering how to hold a pen after years of forgetting. The footsteps have stopped outside my cubicle. Someone is clearing their throat with the practiced patience of a caregiver about to deliver difficult news. Some files, I've learned, never stop updating, even after everyone who signed them has forgotten who they really are. The light in room 314 was breathing again, slow, rhythmic pulses that matched no pattern I'd seen in 12 years of night nursing. I'd started at Millbrook State Hospital fresh out of nursing school, drawn by the quiet dignity of psychiatric care and the premium they paid for overnight shifts. The routine suited my temperament. Medication rounds at 10 p.m. and 2 a.m., hourly safety checks, documentation updates, and the long stretches of silence when the ward settled into uneasy sleep. Night nursing in psychiatry was about presence more than intervention, being available when reality cracked open and spilled its contents across sterile floors. But Ward D had always been different. The 20-bed unit housed our most severe cases: catatonic schizophrenics, treatment-resistant depressives, patients whose breaks from reality had been so complete that medication could only blunt the sharpest edges of their disconnection. Most spent their days staring at walls or windows, lost in internal landscapes the rest of us couldn't map. Room 314 held Margaret Chen, a 43-year-old woman who'd been comatose for 3 years following what her file diplomatically termed acute psychological trauma. The details were sparse. She'd been found unresponsive in her apartment after neighbors reported screaming that lasted for days. No physical injuries, no signs of substance abuse, no clear precipitating event. She'd simply retreated so far into her mind that her body forgot how to wake up. Margaret required minimal care, IV fluids, repositioning to prevent bed sores, basic hygiene maintenance. Her vitals remained stable, her breathing steady and deep. The neurologists had run every test, found no organic cause for her condition. She existed in that liminal space between life and death, sustained by machines but guided by something beyond medical understanding. The light problem started 3 months ago. During my 11 p.m. rounds, I'd noticed the overhead fluorescent in 314 glowing brighter than the others. Hospital policy required dimmed lighting after 9 p.m. to maintain circadian rhythms and prevent disruption to sleeping patients. I switched it off and noted the maintenance request in my log, but at 1 a.m. the light was on again. I switched it off, thinking the fixture had a faulty ballast. By 3 a.m. it was glowing again, not the harsh white of fluorescent bulbs, but a softer, warmer illumination that seemed to pulse with organic rhythm. I called maintenance during my break. Jerry, the night engineer, met me at the room with his toolkit and a puzzled expression. "Already checked this fixture twice this week," he said, removing the plastic cover. "Ballast is fine, wiring solid. But look at this." He pointed to the bulb, which continued glowing despite being disconnected from power. The light emanated from the glass tube itself, as if the mercury vapor had become phosphorescent through some unknown process. "Never seen anything like it," Jerry muttered, replacing the bulb with a new one. "Probably some kind of manufacturing defect. These cheap fluorescents sometimes retain charge." But the new bulb began glowing within an hour. We tried LED fixtures, incandescent bulbs, even removed the entire light assembly and capped the wires. The room stayed dark for exactly one night. Then the glow returned, sourceless and steady, emanating from somewhere near the ceiling but casting shadows as if it originated from a traditional fixture. I began documenting the phenomenon in detail, partly from professional obligation and partly from growing unease. The light followed a pattern: dim during day shifts, brighter during evening hours, brightest between midnight and 4 a.m. The intensity correlated with Margaret's breathing, brighter on inspiration, dimmer on expiration, as if her lungs were somehow powering the illumination. Dr. Harrison, the attending psychiatrist, suggested the lighting issue was psychological. "Night shift fatigue can create perceptual distortions," he explained, with the patronizing patience doctors reserved for nurses who reported impossible things. "Perhaps you're seeing reflections from the hallway, or light pollution from outside." But room 314 faced an interior courtyard. No streetlights, no windows in neighboring buildings. And the glow was visible to everyone. Day staff, visitors, even the cleaning crew who'd started avoiding the room during their overnight rounds. I decided to document everything systematically. Using my phone, I photographed the room every hour during my shifts, noting the quality and intensity of the light. The pictures showed what my eyes saw: a gentle, steady glow with no identifiable source, casting soft shadows that moved independently of any visible light fixture. But when I reviewed the photos at home, they showed only darkness. Every image of room 314 appeared black, as if taken in a room with no illumination whatsoever. Yet I could distinctly remember the glow being present when I took each picture. I could see it on my phone's screen at the moment of capture, could see the illuminated room in the preview. Only later, when viewed away from the hospital, did the photos show empty darkness. I brought a colleague, Patricia, to witness the phenomenon during her break. She stood in the doorway of 314 and confirmed what I was seeing: a sourceless light pulsing gently with Margaret's breathing. But when Patricia tried to photograph it with her own phone, the camera displayed a message I'd never seen before. "Unable to capture image. Insufficient light detected." The light was becoming brighter each night. What had started as a subtle glow now illuminated the room well enough to read by. I could see every detail of Margaret's face, every fold in her hospital gown, every tube and wire connected to her motionless form. The light revealed things the harsh fluorescence had never shown: the way her eyelids fluttered during certain phases of sleep, the slight movements of her fingers against the blanket, the almost imperceptible changes in her facial expression. She was more active than her medical records indicated. I began staying longer in room 314 during my rounds, watching Margaret's subtle responses to the light. When the glow intensified, her breathing deepened. When it dimmed, her fingers would curl slightly, as if grasping for something just out of reach. The pattern suggested awareness, not consciousness exactly, but some form of engagement with her environment that the neurologist had missed. I mentioned this to Dr. Harrison, who ordered an EEG to check for brain activity. But when the technician arrived with the portable machine, he couldn't get readings in room 314. The equipment malfunctioned as soon as he crossed the threshold, screens flickering, alarms triggering, the device ultimately shutting down completely. "Electrical interference," he explained, packing up his gear. Sometimes old buildings have wiring issues that mess with sensitive equipment, but other electronic devices worked fine in the room. The IV pump functioned normally. The vital signs monitor displayed stable readings. My phone operated without problems. Only the EEG machine failed, as if Margaret's brain activity existed on a frequency it couldn't detect. 2 weeks ago, I discovered the source of the light. During my 2 a.m. medication round, I noticed the glow had changed quality, less diffuse, more focused. It seemed to originate from a specific point in the room, and as I searched for the source, I realized it was coming from Margaret herself. The light emanated from beneath her skin, concentrated around her chest and head, but visible through the translucent quality her flesh had acquired. Her entire body had become a kind of living lantern, generating illumination through some process that existed beyond the boundaries of biology. I could see her circulatory system mapped in light, arteries and veins traced in soft gold, her heart pulsing with each beat like a luminous engine. Her brain showed the most activity, patterns of light flowing through neural pathways like slow lightning, creating beautiful, complex mandalas that shifted with each breath. Margaret was awake. Not in any way the medical profession would recognize, but aware and active in dimensions we couldn't measure. The coma wasn't unconsciousness. It was a different form of consciousness, one that existed in spectrums of light rather than electrical impulses. I touched her hand, and the glow intensified immediately. Her fingers moved against mine, not with the mechanical reflexes Dr. Harrison had documented, but with intentional pressure. She was trying to communicate through the only medium available to her, the language of light that pulsed beneath her luminescent skin. Last night, I brought a lamp from home and plugged it into the outlet near Margaret's bed. When I turned it on, the bulb exploded in a shower of sparks, but the room didn't return to darkness. Instead, Margaret's glow brightened to compensate, as if she was absorbing the electrical energy and converting it to her own form of illumination. I sat beside her bed and watched the patterns of light flow through her body. Complex, purposeful, beautiful in ways that reminded me why I'd become a nurse. To witness the resilience of human consciousness, even when it existed in forms we couldn't understand. Margaret's lips moved slightly, and I leaned closer to hear. No sound emerged, but the light beneath her skin spelled out words in scripts of golden neural fire. "Thank you for seeing me." The glow pulsed brighter, and I realized she'd been waiting 3 years for someone to notice her new form of life. Someone who would sit with her in the language of light she'd learned to speak. Some patients, I've learned, don't recover from their conditions. They transcend them, finding ways to exist that make our definitions of consciousness seem small and temporary. Time began moving backward on my third day reviewing archived psychiatric evaluations, though I didn't realize it until I found my signature on a patient assessment, dated 40 years before my birth. My psychiatry rotation at Millbrook State Hospital began in October, with the routine enthusiasm of a fourth-year medical student finally approaching real specialization. I'd chosen psychiatry for its intellectual complexity, the way human consciousness could fragment and reconstitute itself in patterns that challenged everything we thought we knew about the mind. My supervising physician, Dr. Elizabeth Harper, had assigned me to review historical case files as preparation for modern patient care. Understanding psychiatric treatment requires historical perspective, she explained, leading me to the archives in the hospital's basement. These cases span 60 years of evolving therapeutic approaches. Study them carefully. You'll see patterns that repeat across generations. The archive room was a temperature-controlled vault filled with filing cabinets that stretched from floor to ceiling. Thousands of manila folders contained the detailed documentation of human psychological breakdown and recovery, organized by admission date going back to 1963. Dr. Harper handed me a list of significant cases, landmark diagnoses, unusual presentations, treatment successes and failures that had shaped modern psychiatric practice. Start with the 1980s, she suggested. Work backward chronologically. Historical perspective builds better when you trace evolution in reverse. I began with a 1987 case involving treatment-resistant schizophrenia. The patient, David Morrison, had experienced auditory hallucinations that persisted despite aggressive medication regimens. His file contained detailed session notes from multiple physicians, each documenting the slow progression of symptoms and the gradual failure of therapeutic interventions. But buried in the middle of Morrison's thick file was a psychological evaluation I didn't remember reading, a 20-page assessment, written in my own handwriting, signed with my name, and dated 1984. I stared at the signature. The handwriting was unmistakably mine, down to the specific way I formed capital letters and the slight rightward slant I'd developed during undergraduate note-taking. But in 1984, I had been 4 years old. I checked the patient information. David Morrison, age 34, admitted for auditory hallucinations and paranoid ideation. The evaluation detailed his responses to standard psychiatric testing, his family history, his medication responses, all written in the measured, clinical language I'd learned during my psychiatry coursework. The assessment concluded with treatment recommendations that matched my current therapeutic philosophy. It was as if I'd conducted the evaluation myself. Despite being decades away from medical school when it was supposedly written, I brought the file to Dr. Harper during our afternoon supervision meeting. "Interesting case," she said, flipping through Morrison's records. "One of our diagnostic challenges from the 1980s. Why did you choose this one?" "The evaluation dated 1984, I said, pointing to the assessment bearing my signature. "That's my handwriting." Dr. Harper examined the document with the careful attention she brought to all clinical materials. "Similar penmanship isn't uncommon among physicians," she said finally. "Medical school tends to standardize handwriting patterns, and psychological evaluations follow such consistent formats that they often sound alike across different practitioners." But she couldn't explain why the assessment contained phrases I'd used in my current patient evaluations, specific terminology I'd developed during my psychiatry rotation. The 1984 document referenced therapeutic approaches that hadn't been developed until the 1990s, quoted research studies I'd read just last month. I decided to check other files on Dr. Harper's recommended list. The pattern repeated itself across multiple decades. In a 1979 case involving bipolar disorder, I found progress notes written in my handwriting describing manic episodes using language I'd learned from my current textbooks. A 1975 file contained a discharge summary with my signature, recommending medications that hadn't been approved by the FDA until 1982. Each historical document bore clear evidence of my involvement in cases that had occurred before my birth. The handwriting wasn't similar to mine. It was identical. The therapeutic language wasn't influenced by my training. It was my training, applied to patients I'd never met in time periods I'd never experienced. I began documenting the phenomenon systematically, photographing each anachronistic document and comparing the handwriting to samples from my current case notes. The matches were perfect, extending to the pressure patterns of my pen, the spacing between words, even the specific way I abbreviated clinical terms. But when I reviewed the photographs at home, they showed blank pages. Every picture I'd taken of the historical documents appeared empty, white paper with no text, no signatures, no evidence of the evaluations I'd clearly seen and photographed. Yet when I returned to the archives the next day, the documents were exactly as I'd found them, complete with my impossible signatures and anachronistic observations. I tested this phenomenon by asking Dr. Harper to accompany me to the archives. Standing beside her, I opened Morrison's 1984 file and pointed to my evaluation. "Do you see this assessment?" I asked. Dr. Harper leaned closer, studying the document. "Yes, a very thorough evaluation. Dr. Harrison did excellent work on this case." I looked at the signature line. From my perspective, it clearly showed my name in my handwriting. But Dr. Harper was seeing something different, the signature of Dr. Harrison, who had apparently been the actual evaluating physician. "What does the signature say?" I asked. "Dr. James Harrison, staff psychiatrist." "Why?" I took a photo of the signature while she watched. On my phone screen, I could see my name written in my handwriting. But when I showed Dr. Harper the image, she pointed to what appeared to be Dr. Harrison's signature. We were looking at the same document, but seeing different realities. That night, I researched Dr. James Harrison in the hospital's personnel records. He had been a staff psychiatrist at Millbrook from 1978 to 1991, specializing in psychotic disorders and treatment-resistant cases. His employee photo showed a man who looked remarkably similar to me. The same facial structure, the same eye color, even the same expression of focused concentration I recognized from my own ID badge photo. Dr. Harrison had died in 1991 at age 34, the same age I was now. His death certificate listed the cause as sudden cardiac arrest during night shift, though he had no history of heart problems. The incident report noted that he was found in the archive room, slumped over an open case file he'd been reviewing during his off hours. The file he'd been reading was David Morrison's, the same case where I'd first found my signature in 1984 documents. Returned to the archives with growing unease, this time focusing on Dr. Harrison's documented cases. Every file I opened revealed the same pattern. Evaluations signed with his name from Dr. Harper's perspective, but bearing my signature when I looked directly at them. The clinical language, the diagnostic reasoning, even the specific recommendations were identical. Between his historical assessments and my current psychiatric evaluations, Dr. Harrison and I weren't similar physicians who happened to share therapeutic approaches. We were the same physician, separated by 40 years, but occupying the same professional identity across different time periods. The archive room began to feel familiar in ways that transcended my recent visits. I knew which filing cabinets contained specific types of cases, could navigate the organization system without referring to the directory. When I opened certain files, I found margin notes written in my handwriting that referenced other cases I'd never read, creating cross-connections between patient histories spanning decades. I was experiencing Dr. Harrison's memories as if they were my own. But more disturbing was the growing suspicion that Dr. Harrison had experienced my memories too, that his evaluations from the 1980s incorporated knowledge and techniques I was learning 30 years later. We existed in a temporal loop. Each generation of psychiatric intern destined to become the previous generation's supervising physician, reading case files that contained our own future work while writing assessments that would guide our past selves. Last week, I found the final piece of the puzzle in Dr. Harper's personnel file. She had been a psychiatric intern in 1991, supervised by Dr. Harrison during her rotation at Millbrook. Her training notes, written in handwriting I now recognized as my own, described studying archived case files to gain historical perspective on psychiatric treatment. The last entry, dated the day before Dr. Harrison's death, noted her concern about temporal inconsistencies in patient documentation and her plan to investigate archival irregularities during night shift. Dr. Harper had discovered the same pattern I was experiencing now. She had found her signature on historical documents, had witnessed the way time folded back on itself in the archive room. But instead of fleeing, she had stayed to become the supervising physician who would guide the next iteration of the cycle. Tonight, I'm writing my final rotation report in the archive room, surrounded by cases that span decades of psychiatric care. I can feel time beginning to blur, my memories of current patients merging with recollections of cases from the 1980s that I somehow remember treating. Dr. Harper will find me here in the morning, slumped over an open case file, another victim of sudden cardiac arrest, who happened to die while reviewing historical documents. She'll become the new supervising physician, and eventually, another intern will arrive to study archived cases that contain their own future signatures. Some medical education, I've learned, doesn't prepare you for practice. It prepares you to become the history you're studying. The timestamp on camera 7 started running backward last Tuesday, and by Thursday I realized I was watching myself disappear from tomorrow's footage. I'd been working security at Millbrook State Hospital for 4 years, drawn to the job by its straightforward requirements: monitor the CCTV feeds, log incidents, conduct periodic walkthroughs of the facility during overnight shifts. The work suited my temperament. I preferred observing to interacting, finding comfort in the ordered predictability of surveillance routines where human behavior could be documented and analyzed from safe distances. The security office was located in the administrative basement, a windowless room lined with 12 monitors displaying feeds from cameras throughout the hospital. Each screen showed a different angle of Millbrook's corridors, common areas, and patient wards, creating a comprehensive view of facility activities that I could observe without leaving my chair. The system recorded everything continuously, storing footage on servers that maintained 30 days of archived material for incident review and legal compliance. My shift ran from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 8 hours of mostly routine observation, punctuated by occasional incidents that required documentation or intervention. Mental health facilities generated predictable types of disturbances: patient altercations, medication refusals, occasional attempts to leave against medical advice. Most situations resolved themselves quickly, but the cameras ensured that nothing went unrecorded. Camera 7 monitored the main corridor of Ward B, a 24-hour psychiatric unit housing patients with severe conditions requiring constant observation. The feed showed a long hallway with patient rooms on both sides, illuminated by fluorescent fixtures that created harsh shadows and washed-out colors typical of institutional lighting. During night shifts, the corridor remained mostly empty except for occasional nursing rounds or patient bathroom visits, But on October 23rd, Camera 7 began showing yesterday's footage instead of live video. I first noticed the anomaly during my 2 a.m. walkthrough. According to the timestamp, I was watching current activity in Ward B, but the footage showed events I remembered from the previous night. A patient wandering the hallway at 2:17 a.m., a nurse conducting medication rounds at 2:43 a.m., a brief altercation between two patients that had required intervention around 3:15 a.m. I checked the system settings, assuming someone had accidentally switched the display to archived footage. But the controls showed Camera 7 was configured for live feed, and the timestamp indicated current date and time. The system believed it was showing real-time activity, but the content was clearly from 24 hours earlier. I called our IT contractor, who accessed the system remotely and confirmed that Camera 7 was functioning normally. All parameters show live feed, he explained. Sometimes institutional lighting can make different time periods look similar. Are you sure you're not seeing current activity that happens to resemble yesterday's events? But the resemblance was exact, not similar activity, but identical footage playing frame by frame with perfect precision. The patient who wandered the hallway moved with the same gestures, paused at the same locations, returned to his room at exactly the same timestamp as the previous night. I began documenting the phenomenon by taking photographs of Camera 7's display, comparing them to archived footage from the previous day. The images matched perfectly, confirming that the live feed was somehow broadcasting 24-hour-old content with complete accuracy. By the third night, Camera 7 was showing footage from 2 days earlier. The temporal displacement was consistent. Each night, the feed reached further backward in time while maintaining the illusion of current activity. The timestamp continued to show correct date and time, but the content corresponded to progressively older archived material. I was watching Ward B's activities from last week, then last month experiencing the corridor's history in reverse chronological order. The regression allowed me to observe incidents I'd missed during their original occurrence. I saw patient interactions that had happened during day shifts when I wasn't working, witnessed staff conversations that had occurred during my breaks, observed maintenance activities that had taken place during periods when I'd been conducting walkthroughs. Camera 7 was providing access to a complete historical record of Ward B, revealing the full spectrum of corridor activities across all time periods. But after 2 weeks of temporal regression, I began appearing in the footage. The first sighting occurred during what the timestamp indicated was current night shift activity, but which I recognized as footage from approximately 3 weeks earlier. I watched myself enter the Ward B corridor during a routine walkthrough, paused to observe something off camera, then continued toward the exit. But I had no memory of the specific walkthrough, no recollection of what I'd been observing or why I'd paused at that particular location. I checked my security logs from 3 weeks ago. No notation of unusual activity in Ward B, no documentation of incidents requiring attention. Yet the footage showed me conducting a thorough investigation of something that apparently hadn't warranted official recording. More disturbing was my behavior in the historical footage. I moved with careful deliberation, examining areas of the corridor with focused attention that suggested I'd been searching for specific evidence. At one point, I stopped directly in front of Camera 7 and stared into the lens with an expression of recognition, as if I knew I was being watched by my future self. The footage from that night continued for 6 hours, showing me conducting the most thorough security investigation I'd ever performed. I interviewed patients, examined patient rooms, took photographs of areas that appeared completely normal. But none of this activity appeared in my official logs, and I had no conscious memory of spending an entire shift investigating Ward BA's Camera 7 continued its temporal regression. I appeared more frequently in the footage. The historical content showed me conducting security walkthroughs almost every night for the past year, despite my logs indicating routine monitoring with minimal corridor time. According to the archived footage, I'd been spending hours each shift in Ward B, observing patient behavior and documenting activities that never appeared in my official reports. But the most unsettling discovery was how my past self seemed aware of being watched. In footage from 6 months ago, I regularly looked directly at Camera 7 and made subtle gestures that appeared to be communication attempts. Hand signals, facial expressions, even written notes held up to the camera that spelled out messages I couldn't interpret. My past self was trying to communicate with my future self. leaving coded information across time periods through surveillance footage that only I would review. Last week, Camera 7 showed footage from the day I'd started working at Millbrook. I watched my first night shift, saw myself learning the security routines, observed my initial attempts to navigate the hospital's layout. But even during that earliest footage, I was paying special attention to Camera 7. My first night walkthrough included a prolonged stop in front of the Ward B camera, where I stared directly into the lens with the same recognition I'd shown in later footage. I realized I'd been watching myself through Camera 7 from the very beginning of my employment, creating a loop where each night shift was informed by observations of past and future activities that existed only in the surveillance archives. But yesterday, the most disturbing footage emerged. Tomorrow's activities. Camera 7 has begun showing events that haven't occurred yet, footage time-stamped for dates beyond the current calendar. I can see myself conducting security walkthroughs that I haven't performed, responding to incidents that haven't happened, investigating disturbances that exist only in tomorrow's surveillance records. But in the future footage, I'm not alone in Ward B. I'm accompanied by other figures, security personnel I don't recognize, people in hospital uniforms who don't match current staff. They're all staring at Camera 7 with the same expression of recognition, the same awareness of being watched across time periods. Tonight, according to tomorrow's footage, I'll enter Ward B for the final time. The timestamp shows 3:33 a.m., and the footage depicts me walking toward Camera 7, reaching toward the lens, then simply vanishing mid-frame. The corridor continues to be recorded, but I'm no longer visible in the feed. The archived footage from next week shows an empty security office, my chair vacant during the overnight shift. Camera 7 continues its temporal regression. But there's no one left to watch the feeds. Some surveillance systems, I've learned, don't just record the present. They archive everyone who ever watched their feeds, preserving security personnel and footage that plays across all time periods simultaneously. The boiler in Section C has been whispering apologies for 6 years, though I only started hearing them clearly after I found my own handwriting etched into the rust. I'd been working maintenance at Millbrook State Hospital since 2017, drawn to the job by its combination of technical challenge and social isolation. The facility's heating system was a complex network of steam boilers, distribution pipes, and climate controls that required constant attention to keep the sprawling psychiatric complex at therapeutic temperatures. My basement workshop gave me autonomy that office work never could. Just me, the machinery, and the methodical satisfaction of keeping vital systems operational. The boiler room occupied the hospital's lowest level, a maze of pipes and gauges that most staff avoided. 4 massive boilers provided steam heat for the entire facility, each one a cast-iron monument to industrial engineering from the 1960s. They required daily monitoring, pressure readings, temperature checks, filter maintenance, and the careful adjustments that kept ancient systems functioning within modern safety parameters. Boiler number 3 had always been the most temperamental. It ran hotter than specifications recommended, required pressure bleeding twice as often as the others, and produced a low humming sound that suggested internal stress beyond normal operational parameters. The unit's maintenance log showed frequent repairs dating back to its installation, but nothing that explained its persistent mechanical irregularities or the subtle wrongness that made me uncomfortable working near it. But in March of this year, I began noticing that boiler number 3's humming had developed linguistic patterns. At first, I attributed the phenomenon to auditory pareidolia, the tendency to hear familiar sounds in random noise. The boiler's mechanical vibrations created complex acoustic patterns that could resemble speech if you listened with sufficient imagination. But as weeks passed, the resemblance to human vocalization became too consistent to dismiss as psychological projection. The boiler was speaking, not clearly, not in recognizable words, but with the rhythmic cadences and emotional inflections of human conversation. The mechanical humming rose and fell with patterns that suggested sentences, paragraphs, extended monologues delivered in frequencies just below the threshold of conscious comprehension. I began recording the sounds on my phone, hoping to analyze the audio for recognizable patterns. Playback revealed what my ears had detected: sustained vocalizations with linguistic structure embedded in the mechanical noise. But when I used audio analysis software to isolate specific frequencies, words began emerging from the industrial humming. Sorry. So sorry. Never meant. Couldn't help. Forgive me. The apologies were constant, looping endlessly through variations of regret and remorse. Boiler number 3 was somehow generating speech patterns that expressed guilt, shame, and desperate need for forgiveness. But the voice wasn't mechanical. It was human, male, with the emotional exhaustion of someone who'd been confessing for years without absolution. I checked the boiler's maintenance history, looking for explanations that might account for unusual acoustic properties. The records showed routine service calls, replacement parts, and technical modifications that spanned decades of institutional use. But buried in the files from 1987, I found an incident report that made my skin crawl. A maintenance engineer named Robert Chen had been found dead in the boiler room, apparently from carbon monoxide poisoning caused by improper ventilation during repair work. He'd been working alone on boiler number 3 when the accident occurred, discovered the next morning by the day shift supervisor. The report noted that Chen had been struggling with personal problems, a recent divorce, custody issues, financial stress, but concluded that his death was accidental rather than intentional. But attached to the incident report was a suicide note, written in Chen's handwriting and found in his toolbox. I can't forgive myself for what I've done to my family. Maybe if I fix enough broken things, eventually I'll deserve forgiveness too. The note was dated the same day he died, suggesting that Chen's death hadn't been accidental, but a deliberately planned suicide disguised as workplace mishap. He'd chosen the boiler room as his final location, using carbon monoxide exposure, to end his life while surrounded by the mechanical systems he'd spent years maintaining. But more disturbing was the realization that the apologies I'd been hearing matched the emotional content of Chen's suicide note. The boiler wasn't just producing random vocalizations, it was repeating Chen's final thoughts, his desperate need for forgiveness, his regret over decisions that had destroyed his relationships with the people he loved. I began documenting my interactions with boiler number 3 more systematically. Each day, I recorded the apologies and used audio software to enhance their clarity. The confessions became more detailed and specific over time, describing Chen's marriage, problems, his struggles with alcohol, his inability to connect with his children after the divorce. The mechanical humming was somehow preserving and broadcasting his psychological state at the moment of death, creating an endless loop of guilt and remorse that had been cycling through the boiler for over 30 years. But last month, I discovered that other voices had joined Chen's confessions. Mixed among his apologies were different vocal patterns, other people's regrets and self-recriminations delivered in the same frequency range that made them barely audible above the mechanical noise. The boiler had apparently been collecting the psychological pain of everyone who'd ever worked in the maintenance department, preserving their moments of deepest guilt and broadcasting them as part of its operational soundtrack. I heard fragments of confessions from maintenance workers I'd never met, admissions of workplace accidents that had been covered up, expressions of guilt over patients who'd been harmed by system failures, apologies for professional incompetence that had endangered lives. The boiler room had become a repository for the accumulated shame of everyone who'd ever been responsible for keeping the hospital's vital systems operational, and then I heard my own voice among the chorus of regrets. The audio analysis revealed my vocal patterns mixed with Chen's apologies and the other maintenance workers' confessions. But I was speaking about incidents I'd never consciously experienced, expressing guilt over system failures I didn't remember causing, apologizing for professional mistakes that weren't in my employment record. According to the boiler's acoustic archive, I'd been responsible for heating system breakdowns that had endangered patients, had covered up maintenance errors that had compromised hospital safety, had prioritized personal convenience over professional responsibility in ways that had caused measurable harm. The confessions were detailed and specific, describing scenarios that felt familiar despite being absent from my conscious memory. I checked my maintenance logs against the hospital's incident reports, looking for patterns that might explain the guilt preserved in boiler number 3's mechanical humming. The correlation was perfect. Every apology corresponded to actual system failures, Every confession matched documented problems that had required emergency repairs or had compromised patient care. But the timing was wrong. The incidents described in my recorded confessions had occurred before my employment at Millbrook, during periods when I'd been working at other facilities or had been between jobs. I was apparently apologizing for maintenance failures I'd committed in the future, expressing guilt over professional mistakes I hadn't made yet. Last week, I found the physical evidence that confirmed my worst suspicions. While performing routine maintenance on boiler number 3, I discovered text etched into the metal surfaces of the internal components. The writing was carved directly into the cast iron, created by someone with access to metal working tools and the technical knowledge to disassemble the boiler's interior mechanisms. The text covered every available surface: the firebox walls, the heat exchanger tubes, the water reservoir, thousands of words inscribed in handwriting I recognized as my own. The messages were apologies, confessions of professional incompetence, expressions of guilt over system failures that had endangered patients. But they were written in my careful script, with the specific letter formations and spacing patterns I'd developed over years of technical documentation. I had apparently been inscribing my confessions directly into the boiler's internal surfaces, creating a permanent record of guilt and regret that would be preserved as long as the machinery continued operating. But I had no memory of performing this extensive metalwork, no recollection of disassembling boiler number 3 or spending the hours required to etch thousands of words into its interior components. According to the etched confessions, I'd been visiting the boiler room during off hours for over 2 years, working through the night to inscribe my professional failures directly into the machinery I was responsible for maintaining. The writing described system breakdowns I'd caused through negligence, safety violations I'd covered up to avoid disciplinary action, and patient harm that had resulted from my refusal to prioritize proper maintenance over personal convenience. But the most recent inscriptions, carved into the boiler's access panel, bore yesterday's date and described maintenance failures that were scheduled to occur next week. I was apparently confessing to professional mistakes before committing them, expressing guilt over system breakdowns that existed only in my future work history. The boiler room had become a temporal confessional where maintenance workers could apologize for failures across all time periods simultaneously. Tonight, I'm scheduled to perform emergency repairs on boiler number 3's heat exchanger, the same work described in yesterday's inscribed confession. According to my own etched apologies, I'll prioritize quick fixes over proper maintenance, creating system vulnerabilities that will cause heating failures during next month's cold snap. But I also found installation instructions carved into the boiler's interior, detailed technical specifications for modifications that would prevent the failures I'm destined to cause. The boiler itself is providing the solution to problems I haven't created yet, offering redemption through proper mechanical maintenance. Some machinery, I've learned, doesn't just perform mechanical functions. It preserves the souls of everyone who ever took responsibility for keeping vital systems operational, offering both confession and absolution through the eternal rhythm of pressure and steam. The confessional booth in the hospital chapel began writing its own entries 3 months ago, documenting conversations I'd never heard but somehow remembered having. I'd been serving as hospital chaplain at Millbrook State Hospital for 7 years, providing spiritual care to patients whose mental health crises often included profound questions about meaning, morality, and divine presence. My role existed at the intersection of psychology and theology, offering comfort to people whose breaks from reality frequently involved religious content, visions of angels and demons, conversations with deceased loved ones, elaborate delusions about cosmic purpose that blended psychosis with genuine spiritual seeking. The chapel was a small, non-sectarian space designed to serve patients from various faith traditions. It contained basic religious symbols, meditation areas, and a traditional confessional booth that I'd installed to provide private spiritual counseling for Catholic patients and others who found comfort in formal confession rituals. The booth offered psychological benefits beyond religious significance, a contained space where patients could verbalize guilt and shame without fear of clinical judgment or therapeutic intervention. But confession in psychiatric settings required careful navigation between spiritual absolution and psychological care. Many patients confessed to actions they'd never committed, expressing guilt over imagined sins that existed only in their delusional systems. Others revealed genuine moral struggles that had contributed to their psychological distress, family abandonment, substance abuse, professional dishonesty, requiring both spiritual forgiveness and therapeutic processing. My role was to provide religious comfort while maintaining awareness of when confession content required clinical intervention. I maintained detailed logs of confession sessions, documenting the spiritual needs expressed by patients without violating the sacred confidentiality of the sacrament. These records helped me identify patterns in religious content that might inform therapeutic care, while preserving the essential privacy that made confession psychologically beneficial. But in September, I began finding confession entries in my logbook that I hadn't written. The handwriting was unmistakably mine, the same careful script I used for all chaplaincy documentation, but the content described confession sessions I couldn't remember conducting. The entries detailed conversations with patients I'd never met, documenting spiritual struggles and requests for absolution that didn't match any appointments in my schedule. According to the unknown entries, I'd been conducting confession sessions during hours when the chapel was officially closed, providing spiritual care to patients who apparently visited the confessional booth independently during night shifts. The documentation was thorough and professional, showing my standard approach to psychiatric confession, but applied to cases I had no conscious memory of encountering. One entry described a conversation with Thomas K., admitted 1015 for religious delusions involving direct communication with deceased family members. The patient had confessed to failing to properly grieve his mother's death, allowing guilt to manifest as hallucinatory conversations that prevented psychological healing. I checked the hospital census for Thomas K., but found no patient matching that description admitted on October 15th. Yet the confession entry continued for several pages, documenting a complex spiritual counseling session that had apparently lasted over an hour, concluding with my standard benediction and a recommendation for follow-up pastoral care. I assumed the discrepancy was a documentation error. Perhaps I'd confused dates or patient identifiers while transcribing notes from memory. But as I reviewed other unknown entries, the pattern became more troubling. Every mysterious confession log described patients who didn't exist in hospital records, documenting spiritual care for people who had apparently never been admitted to Millbrook. But the spiritual content was remarkably consistent with psychiatric confession patterns I'd observed over years of chaplaincy work. The unknown patients confessed to the same types of guilt and moral struggle that characterized legitimate confession sessions. Family abandonment during mental health crises, substance abuse that had destroyed relationships, professional failures that had contributed to psychological breakdown. But they expressed these concerns with emotional depth and spiritual sophistication that suggested genuine religious seeking rather than psychotic delusion. I decided to spend evening hours in the chapel, hoping to observe the confession sessions I was apparently conducting without conscious awareness. On October 23rd, I remained in the chapel after regular hours, sitting quietly in the back pew while monitoring the confessional booth for activity. At 9:47 p.m. I heard movement from within the booth, the soft sound of someone settling into the penitent's position, followed by the traditional opening phrase, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." But I was sitting 20 feet away from the confessional, and no one had entered the chapel during my observation period. I approached the booth carefully and listened to the conversation occurring inside. A male voice was describing struggles with alcohol abuse that had led to family dissolution and eventual psychiatric hospitalization. The confession was detailed and emotionally authentic, delivered with the careful honesty that characterized genuine spiritual seeking, and I could hear my own voice responding with appropriate spiritual counsel, offering biblical references and theological comfort that matched my standard approach to addiction-related confession. But I was standing outside the booth, listening to myself conduct a confession session I wasn't participating in. I opened the booth doors and found both compartments empty. No penitent, no confessor, no physical evidence of the conversation I'd clearly heard. But when I checked my confession log, a new entry had appeared. Michael R., admitted 1023 for alcohol-induced psychosis. Confessed to abandoning family responsibilities during drinking episodes. Provided spiritual counseling regarding addiction as spiritual illness requiring divine assistance for recovery. The entry was written in my handwriting, despite being composed while I was listening to the conversation rather than conducting it. Over the following weeks,
I observed multiple confession sessions that occurred without my conscious participation. Each night,
patients who didn't exist in hospital records visited the confessional booth and received spiritual care from a version of myself that operated independently of my waking consciousness. The conversations were therapeutic and meaningful, addressing genuine spiritual needs with theological sophistication that matched my pastoral training. But the confessions weren't limited to current patients. The unknown penitents described psychological conditions and spiritual struggles that spanned decades, as if people from different time periods were accessing the confessional booth simultaneously. Some confessed to moral failures that had occurred during the 1980s. Others described contemporary ethical dilemmas involving social media and modern technology. A few expressed guilt over actions they planned to commit in the future, seeking preemptive absolution for sins that existed only in their intentions. The confessional booth had apparently become a temporal nexus where spiritual seeking transcended normal chronological boundaries, allowing people from different time periods to receive pastoral care from chaplains across multiple decades. But last month, I made the most disturbing discovery in my confession logs. Among the unknown entries was a detailed record of my own confession, documented in my handwriting but describing spiritual struggles I'd never consciously acknowledged. According to the entry, I had confessed to professional doubts about divine presence in psychiatric suffering, ethical concerns about providing religious comfort for delusions that might benefit from clinical intervention rather than spiritual validation. The confession continued for several pages, describing theological questions I'd never articulated and moral struggles I'd never admitted having. But as I read the documentation, I recognized the spiritual concerns as authentic expressions of doubts I'd suppressed during years of chaplaincy work in psychiatric settings. The confessional booth was apparently accessing and documenting my unconscious spiritual needs, providing pastoral care for religious struggles I hadn't consciously acknowledged requiring attention. The entry concluded with absolution provided by Father Martinez, hospital chaplain from 1987 to 1994, suggesting that I'd received spiritual counseling from my predecessor in the chaplaincy position, despite his death occurring 5 years before my employment at Millbrook. But attached to my confession record was a handwritten note that made my hands tremble. Forgive me, Father, for what I'm about to remember. Tonight, I'll enter the confessional booth as a penitent rather than confessor, seeking spiritual counsel for the growing realization that my chaplaincy work involves providing pastoral care across multiple time periods simultaneously. The booth has become a spiritual archive where every chaplain who ever served Millbrook continues offering confession services to patients who need spiritual care, regardless of when they existed. Some forgiveness, I've learned, doesn't end when absolution is granted. It continues across time, providing spiritual care to everyone who ever needed confession in sacred spaces where divine presence transcends normal temporal boundaries. The sixth door appeared behind my office 3 months ago, opening onto stairs that descend into a wing of Millbrook State Hospital that shouldn't exist, according to any architectural records I can find. I'd been serving as hospital superintendent for 8 years, responsible for overseeing all aspects of institutional operations from patient care to facility maintenance. My office occupied the administrative wing's corner suite, providing oversight of the hospital's 5 psychiatric units through windows that offered views of the main campus and surrounding grounds. The position required intimate familiarity with every aspect of Millbrook's physical plant, from patient rooms to utility systems that supported our therapeutic mission. But institutional architecture had been evolving since my appointment, with renovation projects and infrastructure updates that gradually modified the facility's layout. My office had been remodeled twice during my tenure, most recently to accommodate new communication systems and digital record storage that modern hospital administration required. The contractors had been thorough and professional, working around my schedule to minimize disruption to daily operations. Yet somehow, they'd installed a door that hadn't been part of the renovation plans. The door stood in the corner where my filing cabinets had previously been positioned, crafted from dark wood that matched the hospital's original 1960s construction rather than the contemporary materials used in recent updates. It was clearly old, with brass hardware that showed decades of wear, and a solid construction that suggested institutional permanence. But I had no memory of authorizing its installation, and the contractor's final reports made no mention of additional doorways or structural modifications. I assumed the door was part of utility access that had been required during renovation, perhaps connection to electrical systems or ventilation networks that served the administrative wing. But when I tried the handle, it opened onto a staircase that descended into darkness below the hospital's foundation level. The stairs were constructed from the same institutional materials used throughout Millbrook: concrete steps with metal railings, fluorescent light fixtures, and color-coded directional signage that matched the hospital's standard wayfinding system. But the signs referenced locations that didn't appear on any architectural plans: Ward F, long-term observation, archives, historical documentation, staff quarters, permanent residence. I descended carefully, using my phone's flashlight to illuminate the stairway since the fluorescent fixtures weren't operational. The stairs continued for approximately 40 feet before opening into a corridor that stretched beyond the range of my phone's light. The hallway was constructed to the same specifications as the hospital's main levels, with the familiar combination of institutional flooring, painted walls, and recessed lighting that characterized psychiatric facilities built during the 1960s. But this corridor was completely absent from Millbrook's official blueprints. I'd studied the architectural plans extensively during my superintendency, reviewing structural documents for renovation projects, safety updates, and facility expansions. The hospital contained 5 wings designated A through E, each serving specific patient populations with appropriate support facilities. There had never been a Ward F, never been space designated for permanent residents, and certainly no underground, areas that could accommodate additional patient care units. Yet the corridor I'd discovered was clearly designed for psychiatric treatment, with patient room doors, nursing stations, and common areas that matched the hospital's standard therapeutic environment. I explored the wing systematically, documenting its layout with photographs and rough measurements that I could compare to official architectural records. The underground area was extensive, containing approximately 30 patient rooms, administrative offices, and support facilities that could house a complete psychiatric unit. The construction quality matched the hospital's main levels, suggesting simultaneous original construction rather than later addition. But the most unsettling discovery was finding the wing occupied. Patient rooms contained personal belongings, medical equipment, and signs of recent habitation, despite the absence of electrical power or climate control. Beds were made with hospital linens, nightstands held water glasses and medication containers, and bathroom facilities showed evidence of regular use. Someone was apparently living in the forgotten wing, maintaining normal residential routines in space that officially didn't exist. I found occupied offices with nameplates identifying staff members I didn't recognize: Dr. Robert Chen, Chief Yin, Psychiatrist; Margaret Torres, Head Nurse; David Harrison, Social Services Director. The names sounded familiar, but I couldn't place them among current employees or recent retirees. Their offices contained active workspaces, patient files, appointment schedules, and administrative documents that suggested ongoing professional responsibilities. But the files dated back decades, documenting patient care for individuals who had been treated at Millbrook during the 1970s and 1980s. According to the documentation I found, Ward F had been providing psychiatric care continuously since the hospital's establishment, treating patients whose conditions required extended observation beyond standard therapeutic timelines. The files described long-term residents who had been receiving care for decades, managed by medical staff who had apparently dedicated their entire careers to this specialized unit. He photographed representative documents to research the historical accuracy of Ward F's patient records. But when I reviewed the images at home, they showed empty rooms and vacant offices rather than the occupied spaces I'd clearly observed and documented. My phone had somehow failed to capture the evidence of habitation, medical equipment, and administrative activity that had been visible during my exploration of the underground wing. I was experiencing the same documentary phenomenon that other staff members had reported regarding unexplained events at Millbrook: clear observation of activities that couldn't be captured through technological recording. I decided to research the hospital's employment records for the staff members whose offices I'd found in Ward F. Dr. Robert Chen had worked as chief psychiatrist from 1975 to 1987, specializing in treatment-resistant cases that required long-term institutional care. His personnel file noted his exceptional dedication to patients whose conditions required extended therapeutic relationships that transcended normal treatment timelines. He had died in 1987, apparently from natural causes while working late in his office. Margaret Torres had served as head nurse during the same period, working closely with Dr. Chen to provide comprehensive care for chronic psychiatric patients. Her employment record described her remarkable ability to maintain therapeutic relationships with long-term residents who required consistent nursing support across multiple years. She had also died while on duty, found at her nursing station during a night shift in 1987. David Harrison's personnel file showed similar patterns: long-term employment providing social services for chronic patients, exceptional dedication to institutional care, and death while working at the hospital in 1987. All 3 staff members had died during the same year, apparently while providing care for patients in Ward F that official records showed didn't exist. But their patient files were still being updated. I found current medical records for Ward F residents, documenting ongoing psychiatric care provided by Dr. Chen, nursing services managed by Margaret Torres, and social services coordinated by David Harrison. The documentation was thorough and professional, showing standard medical treatment for patients whose hospitalization had apparently continued for over 30 years. The staff members were somehow continuing their professional responsibilities, despite being deceased, providing patient care in a hospital wing that existed outside normal administrative oversight. But the most disturbing discovery was finding my own office in Ward F's administrative section. The nameplate read, James Mitchell, Superintendent, Permanent Assignment, and the office contained personal items I recognized from my current workspace. Family photographs, administrative awards, even the specific desk arrangement I used for daily operations. But the office also contained decades of institutional documents that showed continuous superintendency dating back to 1963. According to Ward F's administrative records, I'd been serving as hospital superintendent since Millbrook's establishment, providing institutional leadership across multiple decades while maintaining the therapeutic programs that served chronic psychiatric patients. The documentation suggested that my superintendency hadn't begun 8 years ago, but had been continuous since the hospital's founding. But the most recent documents in my Ward F office contained transfer orders for current hospital staff, authorizing their reassignment to permanent positions providing specialized care for long-term residents whose therapeutic needs require dedicated professional attention. The transfer orders bore my signature and official seal, but I had no memory of authorizing personnel moves to Ward F or approving changes to staff assignments that involved underground psychiatric care. Every department head at Millbrook had apparently been reassigned to Ward F at some point during their employment, continuing their professional responsibilities in space that provided permanent residence for medical staff who demonstrated exceptional dedication to patient care. Tonight, I'm scheduled to attend a staff meeting in Ward F's conference room, where I'll receive orientation materials for my permanent assignment as superintendent of the Forgotten Wing. According to the agenda, we'll review patient care protocols for residents whose therapeutic relationships transcend normal administrative boundaries, and discuss housing arrangements for medical staff who choose to dedicate their complete professional lives to institutional psychiatric care. The meeting will be attended by every employee who has ever worked at Millbrook, representing decades of medical professionals who discovered that some patients require therapeutic relationships that continue beyond typical career timelines. Some administrative oversight, I've learned, doesn't end with retirement. It evolves into permanent institutional residence where hospital staff become part of the therapeutic environment they were hired to manage. Case number 441 returned to my autopsy table for the 7th time last Thursday, despite being cremated and interred 6 weeks ago. I'd been serving as medical examiner for psychiatric facilities in the county system for 9 years, conducting post-mortem examinations for patients whose deaths occurred during hospitalization or required investigation due to unclear circumstances. The work demanded clinical objectivity and meticulous documentation, providing closure for families while ensuring that institutional care met appropriate standards for patient safety and medical ethics. My autopsy suite at the county morgue was equipped with standard forensic facilities, examination tables, tissue analysis equipment, and documentation systems for recording findings that would inform death certificates and potential legal proceedings. Each case followed established protocols: external examination, internal organ assessment, tissue sampling for laboratory analysis, and comprehensive reporting that explained cause and manner of death. But James Morrison had presented an unusual case from the beginning. He was a 38-year-old patient who died at Millbrook State Hospital during what appeared to be routine psychiatric treatment. Morrison had been admitted for treatment-resistant depression and had been responding well to medication adjustments when he was found unresponsive in his room during morning rounds. No signs of trauma, no indication of self-harm, no obvious medical crisis that might explain sudden cardiac arrest in an otherwise healthy adult. The initial autopsy revealed no anatomical abnormalities that could account for Morrison's death. Heart, lungs, brain, and other major organs showed normal structure and function. Toxicology screening detected only prescribed psychiatric medications at therapeutic levels. I concluded that death was due to sudden cardiac arrhythmia of unknown origin, a rare but documented phenomenon in psychiatric patients receiving certain medication combinations. But 3 days after I completed Morrison's autopsy and released his body for funeral arrangements, I found him back on my examination table. The same body, with the same surgical incisions I'd made during the initial post-mortem examination, lying in the same position I'd left him after completing my investigation. But according to morgue records, Morrison had been released to funeral home staff and transported for cremation 2 days earlier. I called the funeral director to clarify the apparent administrative error. We completed Mr. Morrison's cremation yesterday morning. He confirmed. The ashes were delivered to his family this afternoon. There must be some mix-up with your intake records. But the body on my table was definitely James Morrison. Same physical characteristics, same identification markers, same post-mortem changes, consistent with the timeline of his original death. I was looking at a man who had been cremated yet somehow remained available for continued forensic examination. I conducted a second autopsy, documenting findings that were identical to my original examination. But this time, I discovered additional evidence that hadn't been present during the first investigation. Tissue changes that suggested Morrison had died more recently than his original death date, as if his body was experiencing death multiple times rather than remaining deceased. From the initial cardiac event, the second autopsy report documented the same cause of death, sudden cardiac arrhythmia, but with tissue findings that indicated a more recent time of death. I was apparently examining different instances of Morrison's demise, each occurring independently but involving the same individual dying from the same medical cause. Over the following weeks, Morrison returned to my autopsy table regularly. Each appearance followed the same pattern. Morrison would be found on the examination table despite having been released for funeral arrangements, showing identical post-mortem findings but with slightly different temporal characteristics that suggested successive deaths, rather than repeated examination of the same deceased individual. I began documenting each return systematically, treating them as separate cases despite the identical victim and cause of death. Morrison was apparently dying repeatedly from the same cardiac arrhythmia, creating multiple instances of death that required independent forensic investigation. But the autopsy findings began showing subtle variations that suggested Morrison's condition was evolving between deaths. The third examination revealed minor cardiac abnormalities that hadn't been present during previous autopsies. The fourth showed progression of these changes, with tissue modifications that suggested ongoing pathological processes despite clinical death. By the fifth autopsy, Morrison's heart displayed significant structural changes that should have been fatal long before his original death occurred. Morrison was apparently experiencing posthumous disease progression, developing medical conditions that continued advancing even after death had terminated normal biological processes. But the most disturbing discovery occurred during last week's examination. Morrison's body showed signs of conscious awareness during the autopsy process. Muscle tensions that suggested voluntary movement, eye movements that tracked my activities, even respiratory efforts that indicated attempts to breathe despite the absence of cardiac function. He was somehow experiencing the forensic examination while clinically dead, maintaining consciousness through processes that transcended normal neurological function. I documented these observations carefully, but realized I was conducting autopsies on someone who wasn't completely deceased. Morrison existed in a state between life and death, repeatedly dying from the same cardiac condition, but maintaining enough consciousness to experience each forensic investigation. During yesterday's examination, Morrison opened his eyes while I was documenting cardiac findings. "Dr. Sarah Chen," he said clearly, despite having no pulse or respiratory function. "County Medical Examiner, license number 7429. You've been investigating my death for 6 weeks." I stepped back from the table, but Morrison continued speaking with calm authority. "Each autopsy provides more information about the dying process. You're documenting the transition between life and death in real time, creating a comprehensive forensic record of what consciousness experiences during clinical death." His voice carried no distress, just clinical observation delivered with the detached professionalism I used for autopsy reports. "I'm not dying repeatedly," he explained. "I'm dying continuously, and you're documenting different phases of the same extended death process. Each examination captures another aspect of how consciousness separates from biological function." Morrison's explanation made disturbing sense. Instead of experiencing multiple deaths, he was undergoing one extended dying process that I was investigating in segments through repeated forensic examinations. Each autopsy documented a different, temporal phase of the same transition from life to death. "The final examination will occur when you join the process," Morrison said, "when the medical examiner becomes the subject of forensic investigation." He closed his eyes and returned to the clinical death state that characterized his usual presentation on the autopsy table. But attached to his toe tag was a new case file bearing my name. "Dr. Sarah Chen, case number 42, pending autopsy for sudden cardiac arrhythmia during forensic examination." The file contained preliminary death scene documentation describing my collapse during Morrison's latest autopsy, with estimated time of death occurring approximately 1 hour from now. Someone had already completed intake paperwork for my forensic investigation, scheduling my post-mortem examination for tomorrow morning. Tonight, I'll conduct Morrison's final autopsy, documenting the completion of his extended dying process, while beginning my own transition into the forensic system that investigates deaths occurring during medical examination. Some cases, I've learned, don't conclude when the autopsy is completed. They continue until the examiner becomes the examined, adding their death to the ongoing investigation that encompasses everyone who tries to understand where life ends and death begins.